get that on, and I presume I need... Okay. Can I welcome people to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee? My name is Len Duval and I'm deputising for the chair of this committee today. Can I ask everyone to make sure their electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions? And can I ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if we've received any apologies for today?
Thank you, Chair. The apologies have been received from Peter Fortune, the Chairman, and Assembly Member Best is substituting.
Okay, can I ask for any declarations of interest for today's meeting? Can I just, I don't believe I have to make a declaration of interest, but one of the items that might come up this morning might relate to the stadium. I am a season ticket of West Ham United FC, but I'm also on record of being critical of the arrangements made by the previous mayor in relation to the contract. So I'm just declaring that. I don't think it precludes me from undertaking my duties today during this meeting. Okay, right. No other declarations of interest are noted, so members have got the information that they may need to consider for their own personal situations in front of them. So let's move on. Item 3, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing and closed actions from the previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. Moving on to item 4, actions taken under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent actions taken by the chairman under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's letter to the mayor on the 2023/24 budget guidance and Q1 financial performance for 22/23. Now we move to item 5, and the main item of the business of this for our first session this morning is the discussion of the GLA draft group budget, and it involves the Mayoral Development Corporation budgets of 2023-23, starting with the London Legacy Development Corporation. Can I welcome Lynn Garner, who's been before this committee in previous years, I think we can say, as the Chief Exec of the LLDC. Richard Irish, who's with us for the first time and is deputising for Jerry Murphy, who we know well, but has had a recent bereavement, and that's why she's not with us today. And then we've got ever presence of the group assistant director of the group finance and performance of the GLA, Enver. So welcome today. Let's begin. We've got a number of questions to go forward on. Some of these will be familiar with you, some may not be. We'd welcome brief answers if possible, but realising that some are more complicated than others and will take some detail. So we understand that. And of course, we've got a set of formal questions, but your answers may throw up members asking other sort of questions as well. Okay, so my first question, and I'm sorry, do you wish to say anything to the committee, Lynn? Just out of respect, is there anything briefly that you just want to introduce to the committee before we go into questions?
Chair, I wouldn't mind doing that because, as you know, we normally would write to the committee ahead of this session setting out the areas for focus, and we haven't done that this time, largely because we ran out of time for various reasons. What we can do, therefore, is say a few words setting the context, and Richard will hone in on where the key areas of the budget have changed and are of concern and where they're of less concern, and that might help focus the conversations as we go on.
Okay.
Does that sound okay to you? Okay, well, I'll kick off. Just in general, Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park has had a really fantastic 2022. It's 10-year anniversary since the Games, and you'll be aware of that. That's about looking at how far the legacy has come, but crucially where it's going next. and how we build on the solid platform to make it a success over the next 20 or 30 years. East Bank has started to open. The first building opened its doors in the autumn, with University College London welcoming 500 students to the park. And a second academic building will follow next year, with University of the Arts London opening. And in total, with the second building from UCL, so that's 2 more academics buildings in 2023, we'll bring 10,000 students to the park, or close to. Huge number, will change the dynamic, no doubt. We're on programme to complete that construction work on East Bank in 2023, and we'll talk more about that in a second. The neighbourhoods are coming forward, the residential neighbourhoods. This year, the award-winning Chobham Manor completed, and Phase 1 of Eastwick also completed. And we have secured a joint venture partner to bring forward 1,200 more homes across Bridgewater Triangle, Stratford Waterfront. So that's the site that's next to the V&A on Stratford Waterfront, and Bridgewater Triangle, which is close to the Pudding Mill Lane station. The London Stadium is bearing down on cost pressures and has secured significant summer events for 2023, as well as drive forward investor save projects that are impacting the revenue losses, and that's good news. For the first time, you'll see that we're including in our budget submission details of the first year following the anticipated transition of the corporation at the end of 2024. Planning powers return to the boroughs in December 2024. The evolved organisation will be smaller in geography and governance, and that's subject to a mayoral consultation due to take place very shortly. And the new organisation will focus on 3 key areas: maintaining the park and venues to excellent standard for London and the UK, driving inward investment into an inclusive economy approach in partnership with the 4 growth boroughs and with other stakeholders, and completing the QEOP residential neighbourhoods to excellent standards of design and sustainability. Now, I'm going to hand over to Richard, who will highlight the specific budget submission areas for focus today. Might help us out.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, and hello to the committee. So I'll very briefly just summarise. I mean, it's a significantly challenging budget round for LLDC, probably the most challenging for LLDC, particularly for revenue, where you'll see in our budget submission that additional GLA funding is required. We do, like many others, continue to operate in a challenging environment. Clearly, we have substantial inflationary pressures, particularly around utilities, but also general and wage inflation. And that's having a significant impact upon us, particularly on the stadium, but also on other areas of our business, which we'll talk through today. In terms of the wider economy, LLDC is seeing the effects, or still seeing the effects, of the pandemic on our park trading and visitor numbers. It's also impacting upon our sponsorship and commercial income, and of course on our development forecasts, where we're seeing continued higher construction inflation and a poorer outlook on property pricing. But overall, our revenue budget, our 3-year budget, is balanced, albeit, as we say, it relies on additional funding from the GLA over the 3-year period, and we'll talk a bit more about that. 11.6 million, majority of it next year. That, as I say, is driven primarily by inflation, particularly on the venue energy costs. It does also include, though, provision for the deferment of stadium naming rights income from 22-23 into 24-25. Note, as Lynn says, that our budget for the first time includes the first year post-transition and reflects a substantial reduction in GLA grant requirement, which reflects a much smaller organisation that will be focused on developing the inclusive economy, completing our development works, maintaining the park and venues, but also building upon our commercial income. We do have some additional savings and additional income factored within our budget, but opportunities for that are much reduced in the current environment, and also given that we have delivered significant savings in previous years. And then finally, Chair, just on capital, I should say on capital and our borrowings, we continue to forecast a surplus in our repayment, on top of our repayment of borrowings to the GLA. As you know, we operate and maintain a long-term model, and that model reflects a number of ups and downs in this budget round, which we'll talk through today. But broadly, we're in the same place overall from where we were last year. That means we are within our approved borrowing limits for the budget period, with no additional borrowing required from the GLA in this budget round. The model and the budget does, though, reflect an increase in the East Bank anticipated final costs of circa 40 million. Net of partner contributions, that's an additional 36 million for LLDC. But that East Bank increase is absorbed by positive upsides in our long-term model from some of our development activity, particularly at Stratford Waterfront, where we've now signed a joint venture agreement, and that has given us a positive movement in our model, which is helping to offset the additional East Bank costs. So overall, borrowings are forecast to be 497 million at the end of the financial year. We're within our borrowing limits and no additional borrowings are required from the GLA. So just a summary there for the Assembly, and obviously happy to unpack that through your questioning today. Thank you.
Okay, let's begin the first question, maybe to you, Richard, in terms of that. So the budget submission shows a funding gap of 11.6 million across the budget period. So you've sort of alluded to some of those issues, but very crisply, the factors that have caused this and how, and it might not be the right technical term, but in that balancing act of the budget, just tell us about how those balancing acts have taken place within this submission.
I will do, Chair, thank you. So as you say, over the budget period, there's an increase GLA grant requirement of 11.6 million. The majority of that falls into next financial year, 22-3-24. And that's 9.6 million. So I'll focus on that, if that's helpful, to keep it concise as you've asked for. The majority, I would say, of the 9.6 relates to inflationary pressures, almost 70%, particularly on our venues, which includes, of course, the London Aquatic Centre, which, of course, consumes significant energy, also Copper Box Arena, but the stadium as well. So we are seeing significant energy price increases in those venues starting this year, the financial year that we're in, but of course we are forecasting that to continue into next year. Now, we have made some assumptions in the budget about consumption and based on historic trends. In the stadium forecast for next year, we do have an increase of energy cost of 4.6 million. That is net of 0.6 million of consumption reduction targets that the stadium is targeting next year. Now, that's going to be through a number of means. It's going to be the positive impact of capital investment that we've made into the stadium, and some of that I think we've probably talked about in this forum before. So, for example, the lighting system. So there'll be a positive impact of that we expect to see to come through. We're looking at other measures, such as the building management system. So, in an office, you'd have an intelligent management system that turns lights on and off. We're looking at something like that for the stadium, but also in behaviours. So very much trying to get positive behaviours throughout the users of the stadium. In the same way that we are all at home at the moment, turning our lights off and turning things off when they're not needed. Just basic things like that. So we're trying everything from the smallest to the largest items in order to target energy consumption reductions, and hopefully that will play through positively into the budget next year. Also, it depends on the price that the stadium secure for their energy contract next year, so they're working closely with their broker on that, and of course, energy prices are moving by the week, if not by the day. So we've made some assumptions in there, but the majority of it is inflationary increases. We also have, I mentioned the stadium naming rights, so we can talk a bit about the activity that's happening there to secure stadium naming rights. What we've done in the budget next year, in LLDC's budget though, is to provide for potentially that not starting until the year after. So that's factored in there at 2 million as well. So, as I say, in summary, the bulk of it is inflation and utility price increases. There's something in there on stadium naming rights, and then we have various other kind of ups and downs as well.
Okay, thank you. To the Chief Exec, then, so one aspect of this, so when are you expecting the Deputy Mayor's review of fixed estate charges to be published? And how this, and what's your anticipated sort of level of fixed estate charges collected by the LLDC for 22-23 and 23-24. What's your thinking around those issues?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we're expecting the review to be published fairly imminently. Actually, I think there's a final meeting, hopefully this week, to dot some I's and cross some T's, as I understand it, at the Mayor's office level. In terms of how the fixed estate charge makes up the whole, and you know, seeing the whole of the pie chart, so to speak, and the element that fixed estate charge contributes, I might ask you that, Richard, if you have the numbers to hand to give a sense of it.
Well, I can give you a sense of fixed estate charge assumed in the budget next year is 4.1 million, rising up to circa 5.2, 5.8 by the end of the budget period.
Okay. We might want some additional information once that Deputy Mayor's review has taken place, so we'll liaise with you to see that information and when that's available. Okay, so again to you, Lynn, the work of the new Chief Commercial Officer undertaken to increase the income and hence reduce the overall park losses. Just give us a little pen picture of where that's at in this budget, and is there anything in this budget that's going to make that good as a positive?
I think there's a target in here, Richard, for £2 million to be achieved in 23-24. So it's the first time we've put a target in for income directly from the work of the Chief Commercial Officer outside of stadium and stadium naming rights. So this is just for park. Nathan Homer joined us in September 2020. Quite a difficult time for a commercial person to join, because obviously we've had 2 years of really difficult commercial times with regard to COVID and pandemic, and investments in marketing, advertising and so on has been considerably down. However, his observations when he joined LLDC was that he wasn't starting from a great place, because we don't have a lot of commercial activity going on in the park, and we don't have a good jumping off platform for selling ourselves commercially or maximising data contacts, for example. So we had a small number of users who we were able to communicate with on a regular basis, but not a good user platform. And the reason that's important is if you go to a big name business and ask them to invest in the park, they want to know how many people they can reach through advertising or sponsorship and so on. And if on your database you only have a small number of users that's a bit sporadic and they contact you in different ways, then that's a real negative from that company's perspective. So he spent a lot of time. We brought on some extra resources to help him in this field, building up databases, building up contacts and so on, and we've grown that significantly over the 2 years. He's also started a number of commercial conversations in the market, both across stadium and park. And they are, I have to say, they are the most, I'm feeling the most optimistic about landing deals in 2023 across the piece than I've ever felt before. It's difficult to get into commercial details and conversations that we're having because they are commercially confidential. So it's hard to share the details of those. But I just wanted to reassure the committee that we're feeling positive about that. Notwithstanding the fact, as Richard said, that we've put a provision in case we don't achieve stadium naming rights in 2023-24, we still have our foot to the floor in terms of driving that. So it's a provision, but we are optimistic that we'll start to make inroads. So, yeah, we've got a target in for SNR of 2 million at the stadium and a target in for general commercial activity in the park of 2 million as well.
Okay. Can you just, it's somewhere in this paperwork, but just remind us about the, so the GLA's providing an additional, this might be for Enver, an additional 12.5 million in this budget to address inflationary pressures. What's the element of the LLDC of that in terms of inflationary pressures? It might have been something you mentioned, Richard, and I just might have not picked it up. So what's the element that you're what's the actual figure for your organisation?
You mentioned 12.
If the GLAs provide an additional 12.5 million between 2023 and 24 to 25-26 to address inflationary pressures, what's the element for the LDDC? That must be a global figure. That 12.5 billion isn't your figure, is it? Inflationary.
I'm not sure if you're referring to the GLA's budget there, Chair, or...
I probably was referring there, but there must be an element for LDDC for inflation. What's the element you're putting for your inflation?
As I say, of our 11.6 million, the bulk of that is inflation. Yeah. I can add up the number across the years and work that out.
Just send it to us.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's fine. Okay, fine. I'm now going to pass over to Assembly Member Susan Hall.
Thank you. Lynn, I have to tell you, you've been optimistic about these naming rights. I know you think it's funny, I really don't. I've only ever been talking to you about these naming rights. You've been optimistic every year and we've got absolutely nowhere with it. And I suspect we'll be here in a year's time, you'll still be optimistic and we'll still be even crosser than we are now because it needs to be sorted. If I can just go back to the submission also refers to increased match day costs due to, amongst other things, fan behaviour. Can you clarify what you mean by this? What sort of additional costs are involved? And are you actually raising this with West Ham?
First of all, on stadium naming rights, Assembly Hall, I do not think it's funny that we haven't landed that, and I've never said that it's funny.
No, you were laughing.
And during the I was smiling, and during the pandemic years, I did not say I was optimistic that we would land naming rights because it simply would be a foolish thing to say. What I'm saying now is, following the pandemic years, I feel more optimistic. With regard to fan behaviour, the Premier League generally is reporting a 60% uptick in poor fan behaviour and arrests. And we've seen that since the return to football after the behind closed doors sessions in September 2021, which is when we started opening the doors again. It has been significant. And in addition, we've seen West Ham do terribly well, which is really good. Actually, they're successful. They've been in Europe in 2021 and in 2022. That means that we have to cater for more matches. And I'm afraid the European games, and we've seen it in the press, have been quite violent at times and evidence of really difficult behaviour. So for the Anderlecht game, we saw seats being ripped out of the stadium and thrown onto the pitch. So we've seen really poor scenes, and there's plenty of evidence kicking around that. That means more stewards, more police, all of which we have to pay for. And have we raised it with the club? Yes, we absolutely have raised it with the club. Just to be clear, where there is damage to the stadium, the football club pays for that and passes the costs on to those who are responsible. So we don't pick up that capital cost. But, you know, those kinds of trashing toilets and pulling seats up has been the likes of what's been going on. Just gives you a sense of what we're dealing with. We've also seen a lot of abuse of our stewards. And we're in a time, of course, where it's really difficult to get stewards into these jobs because recruitment is really challenging into these kinds of levels. And in addition, of course, we've seen increases in London living wage, which is absolutely right, and it does help us to land people. But we have to look around at other stadiums and what they're paying their stewards and make sure that we're being competitive. So we are facing really challenging times, and we do give it a lot of scrutiny, actually, to the operators.
And is there any flexibility in the contract with West Ham for them picking up more of the costs, given that hopefully they've got greater income?
Absolutely not.
There's not, and they're not prepared to. They're not prepared to, given that they've got a good deal, they're not prepared to pay more towards it.
No.
You've asked. You have no writing that they won't.
No, I haven't asked recently, but on historic evidence, the club have a deal at the stadium. They pay us an annual rent that is now up towards £4 million with inflation and so on. And that covers all of the costs of operation. They've never been willing to make a contribution before. I'm happy to write to them, Assembly Member Hall.
Well, I would have thought that was a sensible thing to do, because if they're going to say no, you'll want it in writing, I would have thought. OK, Lynn, in October 2020, you told this committee that the lowest possible running cost of the stadium would be 8 to 10 million. Does this remain an achievable ambition? And if so, when do you expect it to be achieved?
I'll give you a sense of the operating costs so you can see where we are. First of all, in comparing where we are with operating this business, I think we should ignore the COVID years, because we had cancellation of events, behind closed doors football, and so it's misleading. If we look at where we landed at the end of 1920, the operating costs were around £18 million, 18.4 million. In our forecast for this year, they will reduce to 16.5 million. So we are seeing a reduction in terms of year on year. And in this forecast for 22-23, in that 16 million is included exceptional utility costs of around 3.6 million, which is inflationary utility costs. So you can see that in revenue terms, we are driving more revenue through the business. Our forecast for 23-24 next year is that we will reduce again by about £500,000 or so. Now, when we compare that to the 5-year plan, this is where the 10 million, between 10 and 11 million figure comes from. We had an original 5-year plan. If we strip out utilities and inflationary pressures, we are very close to the original plan. We need to add in that provision for stadium naming rights, but ignoring that, we're doing quite well on the underlying trends for operation.
OK. At our budget meeting last year, you stated that there was a way forward in combining ownership over West Ham with long lease for the London Stadium. So can you provide us with an update of where you are with West Ham United on this?
We are considering our position in this space. When we were talking last year about this, it was in response to an approach that we'd had from the market, from a company that's purported to be in discussions with buying the football club. So we do have a set of, an in-principle position that we would enter into that kind of arrangement. We haven't had any approaches from the football club itself, and we're in the process of thinking about what conversations we should be having following the last meeting that we had here, when Assembly Member Prince asked a direct question in this space around collaboration with West Ham United.
So when was that?
It was a few weeks ago. I want to say about 4 weeks ago. Yeah. It was the plenary session.
OK. Right. If we go back to these naming rights, have you actually asked the Mayor if he'll help?
No, not yet. I think what we would probably do in terms of a process is, when we get closer to the potential for a partner, we would certainly ask the Mayor to get involved at that stage, because, of course, we might be talking to a number of parties over a period of time, and we'd want to crystallise with one particular partner the closer we got. We also need to make sure that the football club are very much involved in those discussions from early stages as well.
I just think that we keep going round in circles. We all know that the Mayor loves a summit. He's had one to push for rent controls. He's had one on crime. He even flies to Argentina for one on climate change. So why don't you approach him and ask if you could get potential sponsors and representatives around a table? Because surely if you can't deal with it, which clearly you're in difficulties, as we all know, and have known for years, perhaps the Mayor could have one of his much favoured summits. Get everybody round a table and see if you can, or see if he can sort it out. He is our Mayor, This is ridiculous. I said to you last year, this is ridiculous. I bet I'm here next year saying the same thing. And here I am.
I don't think it's time for the mayor to get involved, and for the reasons I've outlined.
Which decade do you think would be a good idea for a mayor to get involved?
What I would say is that, as I've explained to you, if we strip out the utility costs, this budget is almost on plan without stadium naming rights. So I think we're doing quite well in that regard. I've told you that I'm optimistic about stadium naming rights, but I can't bring the mayor in until I have a position with the football club and some partners for him to speak to.
But he could find you partners, Lynn. He could do that. And it would be an easing of a pressure. And just because you might be nearly making your budget doesn't mean that you couldn't make more than the budget, that you could be in profit, that would save our mayor some money and thus taxpayers.
Yes, that's true. Well, tell you what,
Yes.
Why don't I ask the mayor what he thinks about getting involved at this stage?
Why don't you? Ask him if he'd like to do a summit, and I'm almost positive he'd say yes. He loves the summit, doesn't he, then? Tell him it's in this country, he might not be quite so interested, but anyway, it seems like let's be proactive for a change, shall we? I really don't want to be sitting here being irritated next year. Right, shall I proceed, or did...
Mr. Josiah and then Caroline Pigeon.
Sorry for the comment. It's about naming rights. So the question is to you, Richard or Lynn. So I can't remember exact words, but Jerry, when she was here before us 3-4 years ago, was sounding very optimistic. She may not use the word optimistic, but the impression certainly I got, the very strong impression was that the deal is just around the corner. It's been, 5 or 6 years before you took over as chief executive, we've been talking about naming rights. At that time, the figure that was being bandied around was £4 million. Richard, you mentioned a sum of £2 million. And as a football finance expert told me about 4 or 5 years ago, that the longer you leave things, I mean, there's no point in getting a sponsor if you're going to get very little for it. I mean, £2 million is not the amount I'll be sniffing at, but really the ideal time was in the first year or before the West Ham moved into the stadium. For iconic stadium, even £4 million, I've just sent a text to someone who specializes, who's ex-football club director, about current values but also what really West Ham should be looking at. So, as I say, from £4 million to £2 million, and I must say, Lynn, I do share Susan's view, what she said earlier, that I think next year we'll still be in the same situation. Because people out there aren't mugs. They know that you're finding it difficult to get sponsors, certainly the price that we would be expecting as a public body. There are stadiums that I will not name, not far from West Ham, that actually are getting deals for the size that they are. They get actually good deals for iconic venue. To look at £2 million, no, laughable.
Okay, let me come in on that, because there are a number of figures that have been bandied around. So, first of all, in the concession agreement, the LLDC, i.e. E20, the E20 company, has a certain set of rights, commercial rights. And that package includes the main stadium rights and a waterfall of other rights. But it is certainly not all the commercial rights within the stadium, because the concession agreement shares them between E20 and the football club. This is why the football club have to be involved from the very start in the negotiations, because we mustn't have a situation where we upset one of the existing sponsors that the football club has, say for their shirt or the shirt sleeve or around the rights in the building, which they have some rights in the building, and it must the partner must work in collaboration with the existing brands. So it's important that we have that conversation, and it's determined within the agreement. Now, in the very early days, the number was 4 million back in 2016 when this deal was done. In fact, the number 4 million appears in the concession agreement as a potential figure that could be landed for stadium naming rights back in 2016. Obviously, times change. You know, we've seen inflation. The club are doing very well. And if one is selling naming rights, then that ought to reflect how well the club is doing in that package of rights. So, in fact, we might expect that number to be much closer to something like 6 million, for example, for the football club naming rights and the package of rights that comes with it. And of course, when you tend to see the big numbers that people have landed, they are grossed up numbers that reflect the number of years of that stadium rights deal. So the 6 million would be an annual, the 4 or the 6 is an annual position. So if a 10-year deal was done, that would be worth 40 million or 60 million, respectively, depending on what you were able to attract in. What we've got in the budget, the 2 million, is a very conservative, prudent number, and we certainly would expect to exceed that if we land it. So please don't think that 2 million is our expectation. It's our absolute minimum to sell sponsorship rights in the stadium. We would expect to exceed that rather more. And the other thing I would say is we can see when we look around London about the kinds of deals that are being done, and not many deals are being done. I draw your attention, for example, to Tottenham Hotspur Football Stadium. It's a brand new stadium. It was built just a couple of years ago. It doesn't have any naming rights. That's probably because the right deal has not been able to have been landed.
Yeah, can I just finish
very
off?
Quickly?
Yeah, I don't fault your efforts. I'm sure you're doing your best, and your predecessor. It's just, again, it's common sense. You don't need to be a football finance expert. The longer things drag on, people are out there looking for a bargain, and so basically you'll find yourself in a corner where you might get a deal, but would the deal be worth it? But I certainly don't fault your efforts, and I agree with Susan. I think it's good to involve the mayor and all the leverages that he has to try to find a sponsor.
Okay, Caroline Pidgeon is giving way to Kripa Shirani, and then you're going to come in after. Okay.
It's actually just because you mentioned Spurs, because it's well documented in the press some of the figures that they are looking at in terms of naming rights. And in the Evening Standard, the reports were a deal worth 25 million a year. So, based on the estimates that you have, are you being too pessimistic? And if you look at also some of the other names that may have been in discussion with Spurs, are you looking at some of those larger companies as potentials as well if they're not able to get a deal with Spurs?
I've seen some of the press reports, but not all of them. Certainly some of the companies that Spurs have been talking to are Middle Eastern providers and so on and so forth. And we as a publicly owned stadium always comply to the mayor's policies in who we trade with. So there are some constraints on who we will deal with in this space alongside the mayor's policies. So we don't have completely free rein in that regard to talk to all parties in the market. I think it's a valid point that we ought to revisit the value, especially in terms of the success of the football club in recent years, which obviously goes to this. We are attempting to roll the park and the football club in, because the park is also extremely successful in its own right in any discussions that we have. But yes, we can take that on board. The difference between, as I understand it in football finance, and I'm not an expert either, but the difference between the likes of Tottenham and West Ham is that historically the valuation of those clubs are miles apart just because of their historic performance in the Premier League. So if we were to go and ask a football expert, they will tell you that the value of the club is much less than a Chelsea or a Liverpool or a Manchester United or a Tottenham Hotspur. But I'm not an expert in this field, but I would say that yes, we will have a look at that and make sure that we're pitching at the right level. Thank you.
Caroline Pidgeon.
Just very quickly, we've focused on West Ham, and it's a rotten deal with West Ham, and you're living with that and the costs to the public as a result of it. But we haven't focused on the other events. How many days are you able to get other events into the stadium? How are you maximising that? And what is your projection for income over the next year from that? You've got Major League Baseball coming back. You've probably got some concerts. What are you doing to sort of sweat the asset on those other days to try to bring in more money?
So there are a number of things that we're doing, actually. Not only the events, Caroline, but the cost of putting an event on. So in 2017, before I took this job, the cost of moving the seats in this stadium was £11 million for the summer events. 11 million. We actually paid that to move the seats 1 year, right? The cost today is closer to 3. And that's because of various initiatives that's gone in, but also a number of capital investments that are giving us revenue returns on a year-by-year basis. So first of all, we've massively brought down the costs of being able to put summer events on. In 23-24, we've actually got a really good year ahead of us because we have landed Major League Baseball, which is bringing in a significant amount of income. And alongside that, we've so far confirmed 3 concert days. We're likely to get 1 or 2 more, maybe more than that, and a couple of other events. And we're running a UK athletics event, which will be a good community event. They're involving a lot of schools this year. So we've got a really good programme of events in 23-24, probably the most we've ever put on in a single year. Baseball takes a couple of weekends to prepare. So it's not only the weekend that they're in, but the weekends they take to prepare. And within the fee, they are charged for those additional weekends for setup and breakdown. So we don't lose out on those weekends that we lose to baseball. It also brings in a huge amount in terms of a return for the UK economy. So 1920 saw £40 million falling into the UK economy, and most of that in London, around 37 million. And the deal that the Mayor has done with baseball is for 3 years. So this is the first of 3 years where we will have some decent income levels. And I think that's partially why we're able to report a really good position in our operating costs for next year. So although there's an operating loss still, it's a lot closer to plan because of the increase in income in 23-24. And when you take into account the exceptional costs of utility and so on, Richard's already mentioned, it's 4.6 million in inflationary pressures that are included in that 15, then we are really close to plan, and that's without the naming rights. So we're not doing too badly there. What I don't have in front of me is all of the revenue totals. We haven't brought it today for the summer events, but we could send that over separately. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Yep. Anne Clark.
Thank you. Just a very quick one back to you, Lynn, just in terms of Major League Baseball. I think that is a really good use of Mayor's time to be making those connections and bringing over baseball. And I think also there's just to point out, there's a knock-on effect in terms of tourism and promotion of London to the world stage when we have those events. So that's more of a point than a question, but just to say how important it is, and thank you for accommodating that.
Okay, I'm now going to pass back to Assembly Member Hall.
Right. Last year you told us, Lynn, that the East Bank project was fairly stable, but costs have increased again by 40 million. How is that increase being funded?
It's an ask as part of this budget round to the Mayor, so it's in our budget proposals. It's actually, the net amount is circa 36 million net of other partner contributions. Last year, we were able to come and say that we were not asking for more money for East Bank, but that there were underlying design pressures, and we were concerned about them. Some of those pressures have become issues. Some new issues have come in, largely around design integration and coordination, errors and omissions, and some prolongation claims from contractors. And on top of that, inflation looking forward, which is substantial, around £10 million of the total ask. So we are, unfortunately, having to come and ask for some more money for this complex project. It is on programme and due to deliver in 2023, but yeah, unfortunately, but we're asking for more to cover that. Now, in terms of the asking for more, although we're pointing out to the GLA that it's going to cost us £36 million more, we've also got in the budget a significant unanticipated receipt from the residential side of East Bank and from Bridgewater Triangle at Pudding Mill Lane. And so overall, when we look at our budgets, we've got a balanced position. So we've got an extra £40 million coming in from the residential expectations that is offsetting this overspend in East Bank, which is fortunate, but it's good that we examine it. You know, it's a significant number, that we're putting on the table here, albeit we've covered it within the budget.
Yeah, it certainly is. Arcadis, who provide third-party commercial assurance to LLDC on the East Bank, project estimate that the final costs could increase by an additional 10 to 15 million, with further programme risks of 4 million to 5 million. So does the LLDC recognise these as reasonable estimates, or do you have a different expectation of further costs?
What we do is we work out a best cost, a most likely outturn, and a worst cost, and we work through those numbers. Arcadis are pointing to the very worst position if we were unable to settle contractor claims where we would expect them to do so, and if the programme runs out beyond September 2023. So whilst we have an eye on those, and I think that's probably Jerry's interpretation you're reading there, she's wanting to point out that this is not without risk as we go forward, but our most likely outturn at the moment is the figure that we've put into the budget. Look, it's a complex project. It's got another year to go. Things can go wrong in that time.
Yes, I'm afraid so. What is now expected to be the final cost of the East Bank project, and how does that compare to the original cost in the full business case?
I'm happy to pick that one up, Assembly Member Hall. So the original, so the anticipated cost now is 673 million, as disclosed in the budget. That is an increase compared to the final business case of 203 million. And I've got a breakdown of the increase, if that's of help to the committee as well.
No, I know we're running short of time. Would you put that in writing?
Yeah, happy to do so.
You must admit it's just run away, hasn't it? In a letter to the committee in January 2022, you stated that the LLDC is anticipating £612 million in capital receipts after 2025. What is the current expectation?
It's still pretty much the same number. So just to be clear, I mean, that's made up of a number of things. So we have remaining contributions from the East Bank partners in that number. We have receipts from our residential developments, but also including the gross receipts from the joint venture developments as well, and also the repayment of loans that are being provided to East Bank partners, BBC and UAL. So that's all included in that number, but it hasn't moved since last year.
Okay. What prevents you setting the maximum GLA loan currently at 550 million to the level of expected capital receipts, which we previously understood to be 612 million?
The borrowing limit, so the long-term model is, obviously it looks at not just the income, it looks at the expenditure as well, and the profiling of that expenditure. So the borrowing limit is set according to our net cash requirements, and that's the profiling that the model shows, and the limit of 550 million is deemed to be adequate for what the model is showing at the moment for the long term, so there's no need to increase that any further.
Okay. Enver, if I can ask you something, the 2021-22 statement of accounts for LLDC shows a net liability position on LLDC's balance sheet of 172 million. To what extent does this indicate LLDC's ability to repay the GLA loan?
It's a huge number.
Yes, it certainly is.
We work on the basis of the long-term model that LLDC has, and that number that we had in the end-of-year accounts is factored into the model. So it does still assume that the recoverability is there, but be it in the long term. I mean, we're not expecting this to pay back now until the late 2050s, possibly even 2060. So it's a long-term recoverability, but it's the assets are obviously there for the long term as well. So as far as we're concerned, it is still recoverable.
Okay. Is the Mayor comfortable with LLDC's finances? And does he think that you continue to be sustainable and capable of repayment? Is he of that view as well?
Is that to me? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we've got every confidence in the team.
Okay. I have other questions, but if I can put them in writing, because I know we're under
Yes,
time limit.
certainly. Thank you for that. Okay, let's move on to Assembly Member Nick Rogers for the next set of questions.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to the panel. Some questions for Lynn around delivery. As of March 22, you've completed 11,380 homes. 53% of those are shared ownership or intermediate. Do you think that building homes of this tenure provides value for money for Londoners, given the associated costs with these properties?
Thank you. Yeah, we do. We have a huge number of shared ownership properties in our area, actually, and some of that is linked to. In fact, the vast majority of that 11,000 is obviously linked to previous regimes planning, on affordable housing, and that's why we have a huge number of that intermediate block. In terms of how successful they are, what we have found is that certainly if we use the example of Eastwick, for example, we just completed 302 homes on Eastwick. Around 116 were shared ownership, that they simply flew off the shelves to Londoners. So they are popular in terms of getting people onto the ownership ladder and potentially them staircasing out. 85% went to Londoners and 58% went to people in the neighbouring boroughs. So they do still seem to be popular despite some of the challenges.
Thank you. And do you track the average price of these properties relative to median incomes?
We do, but I don't have those statistics with me today. I could let you have them.
That'd be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And what proportion of the total homes completed outside of the park will be affordable?
Of the total 33,000. So that's quite difficult to say. I'll tell you why. 11,000 have been built, and we obviously know what the affordable levels are there. A further 13,000 homes have planning permission, and we have indications there. And both of those numbers are looking like they would come out at around 30%. What we can't predict is what's going to happen with the things that don't have planning permission, the last third. So it's quite difficult to say in the wider mayoral development corporation area what's actually going to be built, whether it's in line with the existing planning permission. So the most certainty we've got is around the 11,000, obviously, because they've already been completed. On the park, we can have more certainty because we control the land, and the outturn there will be 40%, just over 40%, of which 64% will be family-sized homes, two bed plus.
Okay, well, that leads on to the next question. So how many homes will be 3 bedrooms or more on LLDC-owned land?
How many homes will be 3-bedroomed or more? I've got the total here, 1,556. Of those, so that's around 33%, 3-bed plus. And in the low-cost rent homes, I have a good statistic here, although it's 2 bedrooms or more. 83% of the low-cost rent are 2 bedrooms or more, and 64% of all of the homes are 3 or more bedrooms.
Thank you. I think the next question is to Richard or Enver. How many of the 25,000 jobs brought into the area are located in the park itself, and what proportion of those jobs have gone to long-term residents?
I think I'm best to answer that question. Virtually all of those jobs are in the park. Mm-hmm. So what we're counting there are the jobs at Here East, the jobs in the venues, the jobs around the park, and the jobs at International Quarter London, which is the corporate office district in the park. We're not counting jobs at Westfield, for example, just to be clear, because obviously there are thousands of jobs at Westfield, so we don't count those. And your other question was what proportion are local people. So it differs for each development. The highest proportion for local people are in the park and venues, where we have most control, and that's at around 70% from the 4 neighbouring boroughs. The highest amount of all of the boroughs is Newham, and Newham takes up the vast majority of the land in the park in any case, around 60% odd. At Here East, the figure is lower, but I don't have it with me and can provide it. And in IQL, it's probably the lowest, because what's happened in IQL is a lot of businesses have relocated from other places. So if you think about the Financial Conduct Agency came out of Canary Wharf and into Stratford. What we're seeking to do there is capitalise on the turnover of jobs as those jobs turn over as far as we possibly can with those occupiers of those buildings.
And who would be the biggest employer out of all those areas that you've touched on?
The highest number of jobs in that 25,000 figure is coming from International Quarter London. And which is around 7,500 at the moment.
Okay. And that is the Financial Conduct Authority,
TfL, Financial Conduct Authority, the British Council, UNICEF, Cancer Research, so far.
So I can't help but notice that all of those organisations are public or third sector. And I remember when we went on the BNP visit last year, you and I had this discussion. Do you have any discussions with sort of large private sector employers about locating to IQL?
Well, IQL is a completely different business to us. Okay. So it's owned by Lend-Lease, the developer, and they have a whole division working in marketing their buildings and so on. And they are very keen on bringing some private sector occupiers in. They're not all directly public sector, but you're right, they're of a kilt, aren't they, so to speak. And it would be great to really land a big private sector business. So they work very hard in that space, and we support them together with London and Partners when we can. But it's not actually our personal responsibility. It's a bit distant from us. They do occasionally bring us in for that kind of support. And obviously they use the Mayor's office contacts through London and Partners.
Okay, thank you. Final question. Do you have figures on the average income of the workers in those 25,000 jobs that we're talking about?
No, absolutely not. And I don't think we hold it, not across all the 25,000. I don't even think we hold it for the jobs on the park in terms of their... Well, we must do for the jobs on the park, yeah, because we're providing their income. So could probably
if you
provide something on that. We'll pick that up.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
If we could, and could we try to sort out whether there are other agencies who might have some information about that give us some pointers as well? If we could
we might have it. Here East might be able to provide more details. It might be a bit more difficult for International Quarter London just because of the nature of the distance from those corporates and the letting agencies. Yeah.
Okay. Assembly Member Hall.
Sorry, I got so engrossed in the naming rights, which incenses me. I didn't go back to one very quick question. You might have to put this in writing for me, but I'd be grateful. Exactly how much has this bad behaviour from the fans cost? Do we have it, both in costs of damage to seating that you say West Ham are picking up, but also in additional cost to you for policing and stewarding, etc.?
We can certainly set that out.
I would be grateful.
In some detail.
Is it quite substantial?
Yes. Yeah.
Ballpark?
It's certainly over £500,000.
Good God.
Yes.
Good God.
On an annual basis.
All through bad behaviour. Thank you very much. If we could have that as soon as possible, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Nick, had you finished? Yeah, you had. Right. Okay, so let's move on to the next section then, and that's Assembly Member Pigeon, I think. Is it?
Unless you didn't want to come in and mesh, no?
Oh, sorry.
No, it's already covered. Fine. Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm going to be looking at transition. So, a different area. And I think last year when you were before us, I'm trying to think where that was. I think we were at the Fire Authority at that time, that building. We asked you about the baseline costs for the transition process, and you weren't able to give us an answer then. So I'm wondering, have you now established that baseline cost for the process?
In terms of the cost of transition, yes. So we've got we put a provision in the budget last year, and we made a prudent provision which hasn't changed. The provision across the budget period is 4.9 million, about £5 million. Of that, a small proportion is for kind of non-staff related cost of transition. So that could be things like professional fees and advice. And then the rest is a very prudent provision for staff-related cost of transition. Now, that could be anything from redundancy payments through to pension strain costs and so on. Now, we're quite a way away, obviously, from knowing what that number really will be. We've made progress in the past year with our planning, as Lynn set out in her opening statement. But we've maintained that provision for now to be prudent.
So that's up until when you transition,
That's up until
which would be end of 24?
24, 25, yeah.
Okay. So so you've got that figure, and it could cover, as you say, a number of things. That's useful to know. So what are the next sort of steps, the significant steps towards transition, which are going to take place during 23-24?
The milestone targets are that the planning powers return in December 24, and in fact the organisation will formally transition at the same time. So the Mayoral Development Corporation area will shrink basically to the park and the estate that we control and own, and the governance will become smaller, so we'll have a smaller board and smaller number of committees and so on. And by March 2025, we'll have a physically smaller organisation as well. So obviously we will have lost our planning team. We anticipate that the development functions will have reduced by probably around 40%, because our schemes will be in contract, they'll have been through planning, and it will be a case of running a couple of joint ventures and monitoring development agreements on the park. So the homes won't be built until 2030, so we'll need a residual development function. But we will be reducing the staffing accordingly. On the regeneration and inclusive economy side, we are shrinking to a strategic function only. So we will lose staff there as well, at exact numbers to be determined, but we'll be working through business partners and East Bank partners and the boroughs to make the inclusive economy piece of our work under a regeneration banner and socio-economic change, more of a partnership approach rather than LLDC leading that. All in all, we'll probably see reductions in the staffing cohort of around 50%, because we'll also be reducing back office support as we reduce front office requirements. So we have a broad plan. We don't have a detailed structure chart yet. We are in conversation with our staff about their career options, about retaining talent within the group wherever we can. And I'm also working on the Kerslake project, and one of the key strands of work there is to make sure that the group are properly joined up in terms of redeployment and internal recruitment to protect talent that might otherwise be lost from the likes of LLDC.
And presumably you've got not only what's going on at the GLA, but you've got OPDC, which at some point will be scaling up, will be coming onto them next, that actually that potentially is an opportunity.
Absolutely, and that's what comes into the group work. So we've got TTLP in the group, the development company that's spun off from TfL. And they have, a significant number of vacancies. We struggle in the market to get really good development people. So they have requirements. We have OPDC, as you say, over the next couple of years, gearing up as we're gearing down. So there are opportunities there. But actually, we're all separate companies. And so the important thing to land is how we can have a policy, a mechanism between us to make sure that our staff can seamlessly move across those organisations. And because we're separate companies, we don't have that at the moment. So that's a live issue. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, can I just come in? But surely, the fact I think you just mentioned it, isn't it? Isn't one of the lost opportunities, but one of the lessons for the future, is that we may well be separate companies in going forward, but there are aspects of those companies that could have been done jointly, where you could have actually, much that you want command and control over the issues of where, it happens in the private sector, where they have other people supplying it. So some of, the legal frameworks that you're operating in, of course you need some separate lawyer provision than you would rely on maybe the in-house lawyer provision. I get that. But it just seems some of the aspects of the delivery could have been done jointly. We could have had one service for both mayoral corporations. And we've lost that opportunity now, and maybe it's about learning the lessons for the future. And is the Kerslake Review going to do that? Because that would drive down some of the costs.
I think together with the group collaboration work, it will do that. So it's in the group collaboration space. I sit on that board. That across the entire family, we're looking at better using those resources.
Yep.
Already we do it on an informal basis. So we second some of our talent into OPDC to help them in various areas, and we've done the same with Transport for London. But it's very much on an informal basis and needs formalising.
Sorry to cut across you, Assembly Member, but can we pick that up? I think the Oversight Committee leads on collaboration issues. And if we can pick that up for the future and somehow their work programme, then we can drive it forward. Because the informal side's got to stop now. It's got to be on best endeavours, because you feel like it and your other colleagues feel like it. We might just get some savings. It's got to be a discipline in the organisation. But we've got to make it work. The problem is you haven't got, not you personally, but people don't have confidence in a service that they don't control. And we've got to give them that confidence, isn't it? That somehow they're going to get a good service back if they've not got it under their command and control.
I think that's right. And this is where shared services is a really good model, and then sometimes not such a good model. So we have a shared service for legal, for example. So we use TFL. Everybody uses TFL Legal in the group. Works really well. We've just had a new initiative whereby GLA and TFL HR services are coming together, and we're closely watching that, because if it's successful, we'll want to join in. OPDC are already in that service as well. It'll struggle in the beginning, but it will find its feet eventually, presumably. But just looking at HR, for example, HR services can be quite bespoke to individual organisations, and so you will want to have your own business manager and some of your localised functions, because some areas of shared service are a little bit too remote for a bespoke business, and that's where I think we learn lessons of what works well and where we can make efficiencies and where we need some bespoke services more locally.
Thank you for that. Sorry for the interruption.
Perfect. No, that's great. Thank you. Because I now wanted to move on to inclusive economy, this new phrase. You've mentioned it this morning, Lynn, in your budget submission. You talk about from 25-26, you're going to have a small strategic inclusive economy team. What does it actually mean? You know, how are you measuring this? How much has been spent to date on this? You know, what's the feel if you're in an inclusive economy, if you're living in it? Tell us about it.
I have some examples of inclusive economy work that we're doing. But I don't think we've quite nailed, together with the 4 growth boroughs, exactly what we're going to be moving towards. So with inclusive economy at a high level, previously we focused on inward investment and driving growth, basically driving the gross domestic product, the value add, say, in an area. With this term inclusive economy, we're more about making sure that locally we're making a difference to incomes, health, well-being and so on, so that where there is growth, local people are getting the advantage of that. And that means that we'd have a whole series of new performance indicators where we'd want to measure the movement. So that's conceptually where we want to move it to, not just counting jobs, not just counting pounds invested, but trying to measure what difference it's making on the ground. And there are some challenges within that. We're using University College London, a global prosperity unit, to help us with some of the measurements and to do some survey work on the ground, which is helpful across all of the boroughs and in conjunction with them. And we're trying to build an agreement with the boroughs on what it means. And that's important, because as we shrink our activity and they kind of take over in this space, the boroughs need to agree between them what they want to achieve through an inclusive economy where we can drive growth through the park and continue to get inward investment. So there's a little bit of work in progress there. And importantly, it is joined up with the boroughs, which is good, actually. It's a good piece of work at the minute.
So really it's about quality of life for people living in the area and how you can measure that, rather than the hard-nosed investment coming in, like the baseball, actually how much that's to the London economy, not to local people in that geographic area?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
Indeed.
So that's very complex. How much has been spent on this work to date?
Not a great deal, actually. We've utilised University College London, as I say. We've done a small piece of work with a consultancy organisation called PRD, who've been commissioned both by the boroughs and by us to do some strategic thinking about what do we mean by inclusive economy, so get a joined up view on that and how are we going to measure it. And that's the work I mentioned at the plenary that also looked back at the convergence indicators and tried to make a judgment on how far we'd come and expose the difficulties with those indicators and how we might change our focus going forward. I don't think a huge amount has been spent on that, actually, and it's been shared between the five parties. I think the key question for us is how do we and the boroughs resource it going forward? And how do we work through others and influence parties on the park, like Here East, our new Shift Innovation Hub, our academic partners and our arts and cultural partners to do their piece to drive this forward? That's the really challenging piece. I don't think that's going to cost us money in consultancy or anything, but I think it's important in terms of partnership and influence of landing that and what the strategic steps are, how we tie people into the future. Those partners already have contractual obligations in socioeconomic terms. Many of them have KPIs that drive outcomes locally for jobs, people getting into creative opportunities for jobs in those buildings and so on and so forth. They already have those objectives. What I don't think we've quite landed is the strategic plan to get from where we are now to achieve those objectives in partnership with them.
Thank you, thank you. I was thinking we've discussed some of this recently. I'd forgotten we'd had the plenary where we did have quite a discussion on it. Just looking at this memorandum of understanding that was signed in October with the 4 boroughs, are you satisfied that that is a strong enough basis to protect the legacy? Because, you know, this is about legacy from the Games, and significant public funds have gone into the park, and some not just to build the park and put on the event, but then to secure the legacy, and a legacy for East London as well as London and the country as a whole. Do you think that memorandum is strong enough?
I think the work with the boroughs, just putting the MOU aside, because at the end of the day it's a piece of paper, the relationship with the boroughs is really good and really strong. Actually, I've been very impressed with it, in particular Newham and Hackney, who have most of the land in the park. They are committed. Things can change, budgets can be squeezed, and that's why we decided to suggest to the mayor that he did keep a strategic resource at the Mayoral Development Corporation level with responsibility for inclusive economy. It's small. I think we're estimating that we'd spend about £500,000 and no more than that.
Yeah, about £500,000, yeah.
Yeah. So it's small and it's about strategically driving things. But I think it's important that the mayor keeps some control over that at his level. 2023 will be really telling, because it's the year when we really need to drive that strategy and get more confidence in the partners and the boroughs to be able to come up with a blueprint for delivery.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No, I just concerned, as you say, it works whilst the relationships work. It just takes a change of administration, change of personality, budgets being stripped out, and suddenly this starts to potentially fall apart. Obviously, there's always, I think, probably going to be some sort of long-term public subsidy for the park. But how are you minimising that, given that, you know, you're restricted in terms of the level of income you can generate? How are you minimising that?
I can pick that up in terms of the numbers. So in the budget, you'll see we've mentioned that GLA revenue grant funding by the first year of transition drops down to just under 11 million. Mm-hmm. That's a 40% drop from where we are now. So a lot of that is cost reduction, as Lynn has talked about. But there's also an expectation for commercial income in there. and an ambition not reflected in the budget, but an ambition internally that we grow that even further. So, commercial opportunities would be one way that we get that down. Now, we've been working with GLA colleagues over the past year to look forward post-transition and start to look at, what kind of assumptions could get us down to a minimal level of subsidy. And in fact, the objective that the GLA have set us is that excluding the stadium, we would become financially self-sustaining in the long term. So once the developments are finished, so if you're thinking about kind of mid-2030s onwards, from then on, we'd look to try and become financially self-sustaining. We're not quite there yet, based on some high-level assumptions, but as I say, the work continues on that. So I think, in a sense, it's a positive thing that we're looking forward. Trying to look out to the mid-2030s at the moment is tricky, but we are doing all we can to get that down to as low as possible.
And are there discussions with Lee Valley Regional Park Authority in terms of whether working together or them taking over even some contracts or whatever, you can reduce just some of those costs further?
Yeah, the main discussions with them are around commercial opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So we're completely joined up with them on commercial opportunities, for example, whether that be naming rights or partners we jointly bring in. With regard to, as I always call it, the cutting the grass and the storage of the lawnmowers and so on, we did have some initial discussions on that, but we have gone out separately to commission. Now, it is probably likely that the companies that are doing their work will bid in for our work. We are operating at slightly different standards at the Lee Valley end to the rest of the park, so there is a different specification, but there's no reason why that couldn't be the same company ultimately, depending on how the procurement falls out. What we weren't able to do was bring the procurements together at the same time because it wasn't working in timetable.
Yeah, sorry, could I just come back in? The one bit I forgot to mention was the fixed estate charge.
Yes,
so, of course, that is important for the long-term financial sustainability of LLDC when that grows.
Income stream. Lovely. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so any follow-up questions on this section? Yep.
Sorry, it's my fault. I didn't catch it. When you talked about the inclusive economy and how much is being spent on the strategy to date, how much did you say it was?
I don't know, Assembly Member Hall. I don't have that number, but I can provide it. It's a small amount of consultancy that we've done.
I heard you say not much, but I was wondering how much is not much. Ballpark.
I don't know. Actually, do you know? It's probably tens of thousands. Less than 20,000, I imagine. But I'd have to have a look at what the commission included. I don't know. If you might be a lot less. I have no idea.
Okay, if we could have that in writing, thank you.
Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. So you talked about commercial opportunities. This question is it to you, Richard or Lynn? It's about the MSG application. And I'm asking this question purely from a budgetary viewpoint. My views are sort of quite public. So the main application was passed in March earlier this year, but I think there's still issues around lighting and the car park to be resolved. I don't know when that application is going to be heard.
It's due to come in January.
In January. If passed, if it goes through all the processes, and all the issues are resolved, how much income do you anticipate from MSG? Are you able to give us a figure in this meeting?
When you say how much income?
Well, rent and...
I'm not close to their business model. MSG is not in the park. It's on, piece of private land that they purchased next to the station. It's not. It's not in Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. It's in the wider MDC area, which is why we were responsible for the planning. But it's not on our land. So we don't have visibility of their business model in terms of how they drive profit out and so on. What we do have full visibility of is things like Section 106 that requires them to produce a significant number of jobs for Newham in particular, and that is in the thousands. So there will be some gains there for the local borough in terms of job outcomes, I guess.
But in terms of any direct financial benefits?
The other thing that they are required to do within the Section 106 is fund a new entrance into Stratford Station on Montfitchet Road, which would be worth quite a lot, for millions, actually. Probably under 5 million, but certainly a biggish number.
Yeah, there's no direct upside for LLDC from that. There'll be indirect implications, but not direct financial.
Sorry, who owned the land before? Do you know?
I have no idea.
I don't know either.
So you acted as the planning authority there.
With a planning authority.
But you would have coordinated the 106 discussions with other agencies and the local council.
Absolutely, yeah. Newham was very involved in negotiating the Section 106.
Well,
yeah.
maybe you could drop an email to the Assembly member outlining some of those issues, do you know what I mean? So he can follow those.
Yeah.
Okay, we're now returning to section 4 of our questioning, which is the important subject of climate budget making. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Just looking at the graph showing the projected climate emissions over time, it's clear that with the plans that are in place at the moment, that 2030 is that that you're not going to be able to reach net zero by 2030. So, Lynn, what are your main concerns about delivering the net zero ambition, and how are you responding to those?
I think, as I understand it, this is very much work in progress. So it's the first stab we've had at putting this budget together. So we're all kind of, trying our best in this space. If we have a look at the park and venues, as I understand it, we are likely to be able to get to the 2030 target. Where we struggle is with the district heat network on the park that requires significant interventions to bring it to a fully decarbonised position. And at the moment, we have a feasibility study out to understand what the technical requirements will be to be able to bring that to a zero carbon position. It won't report until into the spring. That ought to say what the options are for decarbonisation and what it's going to cost. So therefore, it's quite a stab in the dark at the minute around that element. Also, we don't own the district heat network. We are the employer and we can influence Equans, who are the provider, but we can't absolutely control what they do in that space. So this is probably the most high-risk element to the 2030 target. Mm-hmm. Where we do have control, we have a lot higher degrees of confidence.
So there's a kind of list of the main climate measures in the budget. So there's the street lighting, the London Aquatic Centre, the Copper Box Arena and the London Stadium, which all have capital funding against them. The East Bank isn't included in that. Is that because it's going to be transitioning to the boroughs in 24-25, or
it's because it meets full BREEAM requirements, so it's going to be a very sustainable set of buildings. So we're not anticipating major problems related to East Bank. Okay,
so East Bank is basically on track.
Yes,
in terms of net zero. Okay, that's helpful to understand. In terms of the key carbon reduction measures that are not funded in your budget, what are they?
There's a number of items on the list. So we have things like the district heating that Lynn has talked about is probably the most significant, albeit that number is a very high level early estimate as required. Other items on there that we're looking at, things like LEDs in the aquatic centre, a solar membrane on the stadium roof, which is ambitious, and feasibility work is currently underway looking at that. Other examples, replacement of chillers at the aquatic centre, lighting at the Copper Box Arena, further LEDs at the stadium, and the update to the London Stadium building management system that I mentioned earlier.
Those are the funded measures?
No, they are the
Those are
unfunded. Yeah, sorry, I think that's what your question was asking about.
Was.
So we have a list of those items, and again, we're happy to put that in writing. In fact, they are in the published submission.
Okay.
They're in the published submission, but happy to follow up as well if there's anything further on those.
Okay, and what are your plans to try and actually get those to be funded?
Yeah, so active discussions with GLA colleagues on those, because particularly some of those may well be low-hanging fruit that makes sense with quick payback, immediate energy consumption reduction. So active discussions with GLA colleagues on the funding for that, including potential access to their green funding routes, like green bonds and things like that.
With regard to the district heat network, this is the bulk of where we would need to spend money. We do expect there to be help in the form of government grants towards this, but at the minute we're not able to crystallise that until we have the feasibility report and start those conversations with government in that space.
So forgive me, I don't know how your district heat network is set up. Is it based on gas or?
Yes, it's gas boilers. Yeah,
Ooh, so
exactly. They're just putting in the first heat pump now in the next period, but interestingly, those of us who've been around quite a long time and before the games and so on, this was a real innovation, fantastic district heat network across the whole area. Everybody required to plug in. Westfield and ourselves are joint employers of this facility. But what's happened is the grid has decarbonised much quicker than was expected, and we are running that district heat network on gas boilers. So the first heat pump is going in shortly. At the Equans are taking on the expense of that. And then we have this feasibility study running for how quickly can we decarbonise it completely in line with both the government target of 2050 and can we meet the Mayor's target of 2030.
So when the decision was made years ago to put in a gas district heat network, was any thought given to doing ground source heat pumps?
I've no idea. I'd have to.
They probably didn't exist.
It probably didn't exist. Yeah, it must have gone in well before the games. I would have thought in between 2005 and 2010. Mm-hmm. Whether the technology was there, certainly we have, or Equans have, underestimated the rate of decarbonisation at the grid level. And it's not catered for terribly well in the contract either, to be honest with you.
Sorry, it's not catered for well in the contract?
The decarbonisation, anticipating decarbonisation going forward, which means that when it's a concession agreement, which means that when we have the solution in front of us, we may well need to look at the concession agreement and renegotiate it.
Okay, so that will be additional cost potentially.
Potentially, although, as I say, we'll be looking at government grants in this space, of which there are some that look like they might be available to us. And we will be looking at what we can do within the concession agreement that might bring those costs down. Mm-hmm. But it's early days, really, until we've got the results, and we can maybe have a more detailed session on it when we've got closer to which will happen in 2023.
And because this seems to be absolutely fundamental to be decarbonising the heating systems. This is for residential and
Absolutely.
Commercial.
Everyone on the park
is dependent
is required
on
to
fossil
plug in
fuel at the moment for their heat.
Yeah.
So this concession agreement with the company that runs the, sorry, their name was
Equans.
Are you committed to work with them for a particular time period going forward? I mean,
yes, it's a 30 or 40-year contract already, actually, isn't it?
and basically you've got to somehow get rid of all the gas and get the heat pumps in to shift all of that power to low carbon.
That's right, yeah.
So have you done any costing of what that is likely to be?
No, we've got a figure in our numbers that is a huge figure, something in the order of 50 million at the moment for that investment. And that's pushing up our global figures really high. But it's not really informed by a full feasibility study, and this work that's underway at the moment.
Okay, and what's the timescale for getting that work done?
In the spring, yeah. We expect to see the results, yeah.
Okay, and then you'll have a sense of how much it's going to
yes,
cost.
and what the technical solutions might be, and therefore, once we land on an appropriate technical solution, and there may be some further work to do, then we can talk to others about the appropriateness of that and where the funding's coming from. But I think we need the solution in the first instance and how we might do it. There's a number of options that we're looking at there, including heat pumps.
And all the housing
Yes.
and the businesses
Yeah.
and organisations that are supplied by the heat network,
Yeah.
do they have a contract with Equans or do they have a contract with LLDC to receive their power?
Good question.
Good question. I believe it's with Equans. It's not direct with LLDC.
But you're saying that Equans don't have an obligation to... That you say the decarbonisation is not well set out in the contract. Do they... So is this a complete risk to the Mayor's 2030 decarbonisation plans for the whole of the Olympic Park?
It's important to make clear that Equans are 100% totally committed to this. So we're not working in opposite directions. They have a couple of other heat networks around the country, and they're determined to get to the targets they need to get to. So they're putting huge amounts of their own technical expertise in and their own money, fitting the first heat pump at their own cost, for example. So they are determined and they are being positive in this space. We have positive conversations going on at the government level with BEIS and with DLUC, who are well aware of the challenges and so on. So we've kept those conversations going, and indeed with the Mayor's office. But it's a matter of getting to what is the solution or range of solutions, getting to the right kinds of technical solutions, how quickly they can be implemented and what they would cost. And that's the bit that's the crunchy bit that we'll need to settle in the next few months.
Okay, and I've just got one final question, which is the cost of the power to the householders, to the businesses on the Olympic Park. Are they having to take the hit on the very high gas costs, or is that being absorbed by Equans, or is it being absorbed by LLDC in some way?
Right, so this is a very complex area, so I'm going to give you quite a high-level response, and it's also a very live issue on the park.
I'm quite sure it is. Yeah. I didn't know it was, but I know about sort of communal heating systems and the costs which are being...
So first of all, these kinds of heating systems, heat networks, don't fall within the off-gen regulatory guidance, although we are expecting that to change in the next 12 months. And to be fair to Equans, they're welcoming that change. What happens on the standard grid is, as we've seen, as those of us who are just paying our bills in a regular fashion, the price of electricity has been rising and rising, and it's based on the price of gas, based on the gas price, as we know. So that's been, and it basically was rising every quarter, and then we saw more rapid rises, then we saw the Truss government step in, and we've now got, frankly, something quite complicated conversations going on about where we're all going to land. I think we've got some certainty until March, but not beyond that for all of us. Now, what happens with the heat network is they set their prices on an annual basis. And this is based on what's happening in the market in January of every year. They set a price in the April, and that price holds for the entire year. So unlike the rest of us that have seen prices going up and up and up and up, the heat network customers have not seen that. However, they will be setting their new price for next April in January when prices are really very high. What we don't understand at the moment, because we can't really get a clear answer out of government, is what kind of reliefs are going to come in. So there is a pot, especially for heat networks, to draw upon heat network customers in the same way that we've been given help as ordinary customers of the grid. But the way that is going to be allocated is not clear at the government level. So there is some difficulty for our customers because they're obviously wondering what their bill is going to be next April, what it's going to be based on, and how the relief is going to come in. The government itself hasn't set relief beyond next March in any case for anyone at the moment. So we're struggling with those. Does that help?
That does help a lot. And is that a risk for the LLDC in terms of getting tenants into buildings or getting buildings occupied, and also for sales of homes and occupation of homes on the park?
The main risk in that regard is the changes to the building regulations that accord with decarbonisation over time. So at national level, the building regulations have changed, which specify what kind of arrangements need to be in place for movement towards zero carbon for new homes. Now, there is a carve-out for district heat networks, thankfully, which means that if that carve-out wasn't there, a developer might have been able to say, well, I can't plug into your network because I can't meet the building regulations compliance. So what's happened is there's been an allowance for district heat networks to take a bit longer to decarbonise and still meet the required building regulations so that homes can be built on the park and people can occupy them and come into the district heat network charges because of this allowance. But the government is putting heavy pressure on how quickly we can decarbonise. This is outside of the Mayor's 2030 position. There is a lot of pressure on being able to decarbonise that network as quickly as possible in order to meet government regulations in any case. So we've got pressure coming in from various areas on that.
Directions. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Yes. I also noticed in this part of your budget submission that you talk about, let me just read this, in order to reduce net carbon emissions from air travel. And I can understand why on earth staff at LLDC would be flying anywhere when your focus is on your geographic area. So why on earth are staff flying in any case? And why would you be looking to pay for a flight and then a tree to offset it? So perhaps you might think about this.
I'll come in, Assembly Member. Just to be clear, that's the GLA's. That's setting out the scope of the GLA's requirements. So what we're saying there, that was the scope of their requirements. We don't have any that fall under that. So we don't have any. Well, if we have air travel, it's minimal.
It's a question within the framework.
It's a question within the framework of what we had to look at.
I realised I hadn't clicked on the link to really plough into the micro detail. I was just concerned to see that anyone could be flying. I couldn't even understand why anyone would be flying from LLDC, but you're saying no.
We might have a couple of abroad conferences, but very, very, very minimal. In fact, even then, I think a lot of it goes by train. So.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have the odd member of staff. We've had a couple of members of staff going to Korea recently.
Yeah.
But they're not paid for by us. They're paid for by the host. They're going to talk about legacy, sporting facilities and so on. But generally, the organisations pay for them and for their accommodation and so on, which is helpful.
Okay, colleagues, are you content? Are there any further questions? It's just not, I suppose, and a final comment, it's not lost on me. When you talked about the $500,000 you were setting up for the legacy of the Olympic Park, it equals the amount that we're losing out the door through vandalism and ground trouble in the stadium. A sad fact. Thank you very much for the way that you've answered our questions. Thank you, Richard, for stepping in at the last minute. We're very grateful for that. I now need to say some formal words. So in thanking our guests for attending this morning and answering our questions, will we now adjourn for a few minutes so we can before we welcome our next panel of guests. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's
Okay, welcome back to the second part of our discussion. We're now moving to Old Oak and the Park Royal Development Corporation budget. Can I welcome David Lunts, who many of us know well, as Chief Exec of OPDC. Welcome to Lucy Owen, Interim Chief Operating Officer, and I think you're stepping in for Jasbir, and then as forever, Enver, always a guiding hand in terms of these conversations. Let's begin to the first question then, and I'm going to direct this to Lucy. So the Mayor's proposal for a net revenue expenditure of OPDC in 23/24 is 3 million higher than the forecast expenditure in 22/23. What will the additional funding deliver?
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the additional funding, the proposed budget uplift will fund a number of new posts which have been set out in OPDC's target operating model. So that's 20 new posts, which is 12 new posts which we've already recruited to, and 8 new posts in the following year. In terms of programme budget, we're going to be supporting the work we're doing on Old Oak West, which is ramping up delivery to progress our scheme there, including master planning and land assembly, looking at sustainability, progressing plans for new heat network, which I'm sure we'll come on to later, looking at a new baseline study for an engagement to track and measure social value on impact on our residents and businesses. And then there is some costs there for inflation and some additional shared services costs and other sort of corporate operations costs.
Forgive me, in my anticipation to get on with this meeting, I never offered David a chance to introduce anything, but I think that's a great introduction to some of the issues that we're going to be discussing. David, is there anything you want to add generally about where your organisation is and in relation to this particular budget and the circumstances you find yourself in?
Well, thank you very much, Chair. I mean, I wouldn't mind just indulging the committee, if I may, for a couple of minutes. I was reflecting, actually, here last year, almost exactly to the day, I think, and we had quite a lengthy discussion about the uncertainties that was facing that were facing OPDC at that particular time. And that really came on the back of, you know, some quite difficult changes that we had to make as an organisation, a shift in strategy. That was reflected certainly in the 2 years since I've been CEO in quite a significant reduction in our annual budget because we certainly didn't want to be spending money that we didn't need to. I said at the time last year that we would almost certainly be looking to build additional capacity around our delivery aspirations, subject to a number of things that we needed to try and lock down during the year ahead, the year that's just gone. So I think reflecting on that difficult legacy and also reflecting on the fact that Old Oak and Park Royal is without doubt, I think, London's largest new brownfield development, inward investment opportunity. I think there's little doubt about that. But it is a very difficult, complex, long-term project. But I'm quite pleased, actually, to be here this year and say that some of those things that were headline uncertainties a year ago, I think are now in place. So over the last year, as colleagues probably know, we've had our local plan adopted. And that's hugely important because that sets the framework for our plans. They're now locked down in planning policy, and that's very important indeed. We've got our first capital allocation, courtesy of the Mayor's Land Fund, to start some early site acquisitions, and I'm pleased to report that that's going well. We've also had government approval for our strategic business case, which was in preparation when I was here last year, but we certainly hadn't got any assurance that it would be supported. And that sets the framework for moving ahead with what is now the outline business case, and we will be submitting that during the course of next year. There's more that we can talk about, and I can talk, if I get the opportunity, about some hard outputs as well. But there is no doubt now that in order to deliver the next stage of this incredibly complex, incredibly important project for London, we are now at that point where we need to build our delivery capability. And that is really what's reflected in our budget submission this year. We've obviously spoken at length to GLA Finance, we've spoken at length to the Mayor, and I'm pleased to say that we've got the Mayor's support for this. We're also very conscious that this comes in a very difficult budget year. You know, we are not asking for things that we don't feel we absolutely need. And I can promise you as well that if we feel at any point we don't need to spend that money, we will, as we have done in the last 2 years that I've been responsible for OPDC, not spend that money. So we're going to be prudent, but we need to ramp up if we're going to deliver the ambitions that the Mayor has set for us. I'll leave it there for now, Chair.
Okay, so one of those ambitions is about the 1,100 homes, isn't it, by 2029, around that, and the use of the 50 million loan. Can you just explain to the committee how that is work and what you're doing to ensure that you're on course for that delivery, given the challenges that you've outlined of where we are? We're at that very first stage.
Yeah. So you're right, those are the targets that have been set for us. We are in the process of discussing with various landowners in our patch early site acquisitions. I'm confident that some of those will deliver some early results for us. And so what we've done, in fact, we presented this to our board meeting a week or so ago, have agreed with the GLA and now the board our current business plan for use of the land fund. And the capital strategy and the drawdown profile for that capital expenditure tracks the obligations that we've got to deliver in tranches, starts on site for the entire 1,100 and the completions profile by 2029. That may change over time. A lot depends on how successful we are at early land acquisitions. Some may come sooner, some may get slightly delayed, and that's why the business plan is subject to periodic review and agreement with the GLA colleagues here.
You essentially have two shareholders, aren't you? I was going to say golden, but they're shareholders too. You know, there's the Mayor, who's one shareholder, and then your landholders that are predominantly government landowners. They should be driving the business. Are you confident that you've got the pathways and relationships right with the government landowners, not the government that you do business with in terms of development and those, but actually getting the key people to take the decisions on their assets when they want to release them or when they're able to do that? There's two sides of it, isn't there? There's no there doesn't need to be Chinese walls, but are they working together in a way that you want them to work?
Most of the time, I think. Most of the time. I mean, you're right. There is one of the complications here, of course, is that we've got, I suppose, two principal government departments we work with, DLUC and DFT. Obviously, the Treasury is relevant, and the Government's Infrastructure Projects Authority is very involved as well. But also, of course, a series of government agencies, Homes England, Network Rail, High Speed 2. I mean, this is a complicated public sector interface to organise. So it's a very relevant question. Is everyone working together well? I think generally speaking, yes. We have a very organised and generally speaking well-oiled collaboration arrangement across the government departments and with HS2 and with Network Rail. That has a series of working arrangements, including a senior sponsors group, which is chaired by the commercial director at the government's Infrastructure Projects Authority. I sit on that, as do the relevant sponsor directors at DFT and DLUC for Homes England and High Speed 2. Just drilling down a little bit more in terms of responding to the question, HS2 have their own arrangements, they have their own requirements and obligations. They are working very closely with us. But it's important to bear in mind that the High Speed 2 land interests at Old Oak are actually not held by High Speed 2. They're actually held by the Secretary of State for Transport. So if you like, the principal player there is DfT and government directly. Network Rail is slightly different because Network Rail currently has its own independent legal status. So they're assets that we are interested in releasing. They're surplus assets. We're working very closely indeed with Robin Dobson, their new property director. He was down on site just a few weeks ago with Peter Hendy, well known to most of the members here, the chair of Network Rail. We are, I think we're in lockstep with them. Peter was very, very clear about wanting to support the project, wanting to accelerate the process of releasing assets where they can be defined as being surplus. But I wouldn't pretend that this is easy or straightforward. And aligning all of those public interests in some sort of arrangement that can then speak to the market to attract the relevant investors and developers to bring the whole scheme forward in a streamlined, efficient and accountable way is one of the big challenges that we are dealing with and that needs to be nailed down next year.
Okay. Let's just move on, I suppose, back to Lucy. On the OPDC submission finally contains a capital strategy. This shows an affordable housing grant line. Which what is that referring to, and how much funding has been secured? So there's a line in your budget that we couldn't quite understand. It's an affordable housing grant, as quotes. That's how you describe it in your budget line. Please write back to us and explain that to us rather than answer now, and rather you trawl through of where it is. I'm now going to pass on to Assembly Member Hall.
Good morning, thank you. You haven't published, I'm going back to the original questions that the Chairman asked. You haven't published details of your monthly spending over £250 since January this year. So why is that?
Apologies if that hasn't been published. I will have to look into that. So I'll have to look into that and get back. We should be publishing it every month. I know there have been problems with the website recently since it was updated with things going live, but apologies. I will look into that and
yes, please, because it isn't there. Can you send them straight to us as well?
Yes.
Of the 10 months of spending data for 21-22 that is available, a total of £1.3 million has been spent on management and support consultancy. So what sort of work is this?
In terms of the work that we've been doing with management consultancies, it is mostly to support the work we're doing on Old Oak West, to support the outline business case that we are creating jointly with government, and also quite a lot of work we're doing on the scheme development of the lands there, and preparation for an SPD around Old Oak West. Okay,
it's a lot of money, so if you could send us more breakdown of details for the next period, please. Your budget submission includes 7 key deliverables, which is paragraph 8.7. What KPIs or performance measures are you deploying to monitor progress against these?
So we set out in our at the beginning of the financial year our management plan, which sets out the key milestones that we intend to meet over the coming year, which we report on every quarter in our quarterly monitoring. So I can send those quarterly reports to you that sets out all those milestones and the KPIs that we meet every. So that's on our quarterly reporting, which is published every quarter. I can send that to you because that sets it out in quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you. And then we'll find out where they are so that we can look them up next time, which is helpful. Thank you. And your submission describes the use of £50 million as the corporation's first major investment in the OPDC area. OPDC has existed for nearly 8 years. Wouldn't you say that it's a bit late in the day to be making your first major investment?
Yeah, I think one of the slight frustrations, if I'm honest, about running OPDC is unlike the other MDC that you've been talking with this morning, it was created in 2015 with no capital budget and no land assets. And that has obviously meant that we've had to look quite carefully at how we can assemble the land that we need and achieve the kind of capital programme that's going to be necessary to bring forward such a large and complex project. Now, you know, the first period of OPDC's existence was very much focused on attempting to get some very early delivery away. That didn't prove possible for a number of reasons that have been discussed at this committee and elsewhere in the Assembly over a number of years. We've now shifted the strategy over the last couple of years to what I think is a much more credible and deliverable plan, very much looking at assembling and consolidating, if you like, the public sector land interests. That's exactly what this budget submission is very much focused on. The big priority next year is sealing the deal that will enable us to consolidate those 60 or 70 acres of land that are under the control of the Secretary of State for Transport and Network Rail. If we can do that and also assemble a funding strategy alongside that, which we think is perfectly credible, then we will be in a very, very powerful position to drive forward the delivery of the regeneration of Old Oak. But I'm not going to sit here and deny the fact that without land and capital budget, it's been a very difficult project to drive at anything like the pace that's been required.
Well, that's right, and very expensive for us taxpayers. So how much has the OPDC cost over the 8 years before making its first major investment? How much has this actually cost taxpayers so far from the beginning? I know it can't be that much since you've got no capital budgets and no land assets. So I'm assuming it's a small amount.
Well, no. I mean, I think since OPDC was set up, it's something like 39 million. But that represents
39 million. Let me write that down. 39 million.
Yeah.
And you've
39 million until the end of last year.
No capital budgets and no land assets. Right.
No, but that represents running an organisation that has statutory planning functions over 3 boroughs. It also represents expenditure in an organisation, and we can talk about the hard milestones and achievements if we need to, that's delivered thousands of new homes and presided over some really important investment in new business, public realm and so forth.
It's delivered. What has it delivered so far?
It's delivered, well, we've
actually delivered.
Okay, so we have delivered something like just over 7,000 new homes through planning consents. Nearly 3,500 of those are now complete. We've
3,000 completed.
Yeah, 3,000, just over 3,300 at the last count. We've done a lot of work to support local businesses in Park Royal. We've produced a local plan that, as I was saying a few minutes ago, is the essential framework, foundation, if you like, for driving forward the plans that the Mayor has set for us. But I think it's important to acknowledge as well that the principal reason why OPDC was created back in 2015 by the previous Mayor was because the promise of bringing high-speed 2 services and Elizabeth Line services and Great Western services into the heart of this really quite neglected area ought to be the powerhouse for new homes and new jobs. And it's important, I think, to acknowledge that until relatively recently, and in fact I think until a year last February, there was still no certainty that High Speed 2 would actually be completed. There was a lot of speculation that it may be abandoned. So I think that did place a considerable degree of uncertainty over the future of the project, and a degree of uncertainty that clearly neither the Mayor nor OPDC had any direct control over. Now that uncertainty has been removed, which is very welcome, and since then we have spent a considerable amount of time and a not inconsiderable amount of time amount of money re-gearing our plans and strategies to really make this a credible project, working not just with colleagues here at the GLA, but colleagues across government to support the business case that I'm happy to say has now been approved at a strategic level and which now needs to be driven into delivery, which is why the budget submission is such that it is.
And obviously all the nonsenses with Car Giant didn't help. But that we've gone over that, so I won't go over that before. So just so I'm sure, £39 million in 8 years. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, if I can just clarify, I think 39 million was up to the end of last year. So if we want to be entirely accurate, because I don't want to mislead the committee, I think that figure's probably now 44 million.
44 million?
Yeah.
Okay, shall I wait a bit more and it'll go up, or is the 44 million? It's cost £44 million of taxpayers' money over 8 years to get to where we are now.
Well, the figure will go up because unless OPDC...
Of course it will. The figure for the OPDC goes up and up and up, and the delivery has been more and more disappointing. But I'll leave it at that. 44 million. I'll scrub out the 39. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, let's not just leave it there. So, in terms of corporations, whether it's LDD, even Docklands, previous Docklands, but going back, or even Peter Lee corporations, is that lead-in time for a project of this nature reasonable or unreasonable? I'm always interested in accelerators, but given where you were and you've had to rechange and refocus the strategy, where would you say, just as a commentary on that previous years? Given where Boris Johnson took his decision of investment, where would that be?
Well, it's an interesting point. I think, if I can think back over my career in regeneration, think about projects like Canary Wharf. I mean, Canary Wharf began as a fairly derelict site, had some parallels perhaps with Old Oak. That began life as a regeneration aspiration in 1980, 81. If you go down there today, it's obviously transformed. It's still not finished. And we are, 40 odd years later. I'm thinking about King's Cross. I mean, I remember in a previous role at the GLA having responsibility for the planning team, which awarded the planning consent to Argent in, I don't know when that would have been, perhaps 2006, 2007. And obviously there was a considerable period of time before the planning consent was granted. So that project is at least 20 years old. It is still not finished. I was on the board of Barking Riverside for many years. That project began, I think, in the late 80s, very early 90s. It is still nowhere near finished. These big projects obviously take a considerable amount of time. So actually, the 7 years since OPDC was first set up, which I need to emphasise have not been fallow years. There's been a lot of new home building, there's been a lot of investment, there's been a lot of progress to set the framework for the big strategic changes. That's not been wasted. But actually, that's 7 years in the context of a project of this scale and complexity is certainly not out of kilter with any of those big success stories that London now celebrates. To some extent, I would accept that something like LLDC is a bit of an exception to that rule, because as we know, if you spend £9.5 billion bringing the Olympic Games to London with a hard stop deadline, then you are going to find things happening a lot more quickly. But we are fairly typical, I think, in terms of the lead time it takes to get really big projects organised and underway.
Okay, right, let's move on. Right, Emma Best.
Thanks, Chair. Just quickly, David, you mentioned that business case. We were discussing that at Planning and Regen a couple of weeks back. You said there was a couple of options on the table. It sounded like you've got a definitive case of what you're putting through. Is that the case that you're putting through to government to ask for funding?
So the business case will, and Lucy may want to say something about this as well, but the outline business case that we're due to submit round about May, June next year will look at a number of things. The most important thing it will look at is moving forward with the principle that was agreed in the strategic case that there should be a comprehensive approach to the organisation of the land assets at Old Oak. That's the key point. Now, quite what form that will take is a matter for the OBC to present, and ultimately that decision will need to be taken by ministers. And we're looking at a range of options, one obvious option would be a complete land transfer to the Mayor and OPDC. We're also exploring options like the possibility of land pooling, where there's a collaboration between the various owners. I think it's fair to say at this stage nothing has been determined in terms of preferred options and outcomes, but that work is ongoing, and early in the new year we will start to bring that into sharp focus so that there are clear recommendations in the OBC. There are also, of course, linked to that, options for how a funding strategy might evolve. I think I mentioned last time we met at the Regeneration and Planning Committee, obviously one option would be to supply a fairly substantial amount of subsidy or grant funding in some way to meet the cash flow needs and the infrastructure support for a project like this. Another could be based on the idea that the public sector might want to use its land as a longer term investment and so make it a much less grant hungry scheme, if you like. And there are examples in the public sector of both of those options and others, and that's what the OBC is going to have to analyse, come forward with recommendations on.
I think it piqued my interest because I thought it sounded, the wording you just used, like there was a much more definitive business case on the table, but it sounds like you're still obviously working that out. So you don't know an amount of money that you're asking government to come forward with, or a plan that you're asking them to support at this point?
No, I mean we did quite a lot of work actually for the strategic case, looking at potential funding options and what might be required. That's all being tested at a deeper, a more up-to-date level, because obviously costs and values move quite quickly, and that's something that the OBC will settle. But no, at this point we haven't got a firm funding ask.
Thanks. I think that's important to note, because obviously when we came and did the site visit, you showed us the video where the Mayor calls on the government to support the project, and I think it's very difficult to make that call saying now the government needs to support us when you're not actually asking them definitively for anything.
No, but I think we will be, and the OBC will have to define that ask.
Yes, so I think it's fair to make sure the ask in itself sounds as though government aren't supporting you, when perhaps I think that it's clear to say that there hasn't been an ask yet. So you know, within that kind of way, I think that's the way in which you should ask, is when we come forward with an offer or with a proposal, then hopefully government will support it. But to be saying government needs to support us now when you're not asking for anything particularly, I don't think that's the right way to go.
I think that's a fair comment, and I would just add for the record that, you know, government is supporting us at the moment, quite directly actually, through the support we get from Homes England, from DFT, from DLUC. That's not just staff time, but also contributing to the costs of working on the OBC. So I'm certainly not of the view that government is refusing to support us. What government have not yet been asked for definitively is a clear offer or a clear ask around the land and the funding, and of course that's what the OBC will clarify in the early to middle part of next year. But at the moment, you know, we've got a very structured and successful, I think, relationship with the key government agencies.
But it goes back to the earlier point, isn't it? Actually, clearer decision making by the different partners, both government and here, is actually worth considerable amount of money of investment, being very clear about that and taking those decisions at the right time. And then there's a separate conversation about whether there's government grant and subsidy around some of the housing infrastructure stroke or affordable housing offer. They're the two issues, isn't it? I mean, that sense. So in that, you know, it's good to hear that government is coming, or the agencies, shouldn't talk about government, but they are government agencies, come into play, because it's a win for them as much as it's a win for us in London, isn't it? If we can get it right.
I think that's exactly right, Chair. And I think, you know, if we think in rather simplistic terms of the state, whether that's London government, national government's agency, or the public sector, if you like, I think there is little doubt that if we can come together and create a sensible and fairly simple and straightforward offer that brings together the land assets and a sensible funding strategy, then that will leverage a colossal amount of investment from the private sector. And that's the key point here. We're not going to drive this project with 100% from the public sector. But all of our feedback from investors that we talk to, the major developers, some of whom are household names, that are interested in schemes of this scale and complexity, the feedback is universal. This is a fantastic opportunity, you know, with a £1.7 billion new interchange and close on 100 acres of development land around it. Why wouldn't those organisations be interested? But they want the public sector to be speaking with one voice and be joined up. And without that, change will happen at Old Oak, but it will probably be suboptimal and it will be quite disjointed.
Can I just ask one more question? How do we make sure that we speak with that one voice? Because like I said, it didn't sound like it in that video that I watched, and I'd like to think that we are speaking with one voice. And like you say, you've got a good relationship with government, so how do we make sure that it comes across as though all parties are working hand in hand, which it sounds as though they are? So I think, how do we make sure that's the perception instead of the what I think was the perception from the video we were showing?
Well, that's really interesting feedback, and I take that very seriously. So we will look at whether we need to review or revise the communications and the way that we're messaging. But I'm saying to you here today, I'm not of the view that government is hostile to this. And in fact, I think I know from recent conversations that the Mayor's had with, you know, leading ministers, there is definitely a government interest in making Old Oak a bit of an exemplar in terms of bringing growth, investment and regeneration opportunities into the High Speed 2 narrative. So I will take that away and we will look at whether we need to tweak any of our communications messaging.
Good point. Well done. Okay, let's move on to our second section of formal questioning, and I'm going to Assembly Member Caroline Pidgeon.
Thank you. So we've started already talking over some of this, so I'll try not to repeat some of the sort of points that have been raised. But I just want to take a step back because I'll briefly talk about the strategic outline business case, and it says that was submitted in February and was approved by DFT and the other department. And then, so is it now the outline business case you're working on? Could you want to just, I'm not a planning expert, just clarify exactly what it is you're working on? And obviously, what were the key asks in that strategic outline business case, just so we're all clear, because obviously some members have very detailed knowledge from the planning committee.
Okay, so this isn't a planning document, just so you're aware.
Okay.
So what this is the business case to government in terms of the ask to consolidate land, and then, as David was saying, potentially a funding package to go alongside that, depending on what is needed. And it's the best practice set out by the IPA, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, in terms of business case preparation prior to any public money being spent. So that's a process we're following. So the strategic outline business case set out, if you like, the what. So the ask of government in that, which was approved, as we said, in February, was the principles of what we want to do at Old Oak West. So the principle of consolidating land was agreed, and looking at the redevelopment in Old Oak West in a comprehensive way rather than piecemeal development. So that was agreed. That was agreed. And the principle of looking at some type of funding package and how the best way of funding that. So if you like, the strategic outline business case sets out the what, and that's been approved. You then move to the next stage. So if you like, that's one gateway. And then the next, sorry, it does get complicated.
Yeah.
The next stage is the outline business case. And if you like, that's what we're doing now, very closely, as David said, very closely with a team from Homes England, from DFT, from D-Light. We work together. We have working groups, you know, all the time together. So it's a really good collaborative team. That's going to set out the how. How do we do it? So the principle of land consolidation has been agreed. How do we do that? And then there's work ongoing. So to work, you know, how can we do that, and how will that be attractive to the market? You know, because we have to. The principle here is that then we need to look at, you know, a developer who's going to be interested in, you know, taking this development on. So there's lots working on that. It's how we do it, how can we fund it, and all the different funding streams, as David said, ways that could be looked at that. and then how we will manage it. So the management case, if you like, of how we do that and how the governance will be set up.
Cool.
So it's a high level.
Yeah.
There's lots in it, but there's lots going on. You know, the infrastructure costs, etc. So that's all the work we're doing now, very collaboratively with government.
I've got my head around that now. Yes, the planning was the separate thing which you got through. Yeah, great. Okay, so that's where you are with that. So the government said, in principle, agreement to consolidate the land into single ownership. What does that actually mean? Is it just we're happy for you to proceed, or is it really, yeah, this is where we're going? What does it mean in principle?
It really means that if we take a sort of step back, I think one thing that absolutely everybody agrees on is that, you know, this part of London is going to change because you don't, you know, put an enormous great station and infrastructure in without change. So there's going to be a lot of interest in new homes, new jobs and all the rest of it. But it is currently quite a disjointed, difficult site. There's a need to get a strategic level of infrastructure into this place. There's a need to kind of curate it so that we don't just get a series of one-off development sites that don't create a really kind of great new urban district for London. And really that's what the strategic case agreed. Okay, the strategic case accepted that process of change needs to be managed,
coordinated,
rather than just happen by accident, if you like. So the question now is, well, okay, that's right. How does that actually work? You know, does that mean, as I was saying earlier, that the land lock, stock and barrel has to be transferred legally to, you know, OPDC? Is there another way that might bring the land in a much more phased way, where, you know, you control the way that the land comes in with, if you like, a guiding hand, but you don't necessarily need to legally transfer it? So that's exactly what the OBC is examining. And at this point, I don't know where that will land because the decisions have not been taken. But it is complicated, but it's fascinating because we're actually talking, as Lucy says now, not so much about is this a good idea, but how do we make it work?
It's the mechanics of it. And I mean, this has been the age-old problem every year when we see you at this committee is you've got this memorandum of understanding, but what value is that? Yeah. How can you actually build this out, your vision? So you said early in the new year you're going to hopefully have some more ideas around this. Are you looking at other places? I mean, have you looked obviously at LLDC on our doorstep, Royal Docks? Are you looking internationally at other sort of experiences where there's complex land holdings to see if there's a model there that might work?
Yeah, very much so. And you know, one of the things that we've done in preparing this budget submission is actually spend time talking and looking to other organisations in London. So obviously LLDC, I mentioned Barking Riverside. We've looked at what TfL are doing. We've looked across the piece at where there are examples of projects at sort of similar scale and complexity, if there are any, to try and get some idea about, you know, what resources, whether what we're looking for in terms of additional resource sort of matches what is good practice elsewhere. So we've done that kind of stress testing. In terms of looking at, you know, other examples of how projects actually are assembled where land and funding issues are quite complicated, again, very much so. So, you know, someone that, you know, I've spent a lot of time talking to actually is Peter Freeman, who's the chair of Homes England. Peter put together the King's Cross scheme for Argent in his private sector days. That's been really interesting because that's quite a relevant example in some ways because the public sector did have a major interest there through Rail Track Network Rail, London Continental Railways, which was is the government's kind of transport development company, if you like, chose to effectively pool their land. So Argent had control of the overall scheme, and that meant they could deliver something that was comprehensive. We've looked at and we've spent quite a lot of time actually talking to colleagues who are also running major HS2 related schemes in the Midlands in particular. So we've been up to Arden Cross to talk to the people that have done a land pooling agreement there. It's happy to say for them, it's a less complicated one than the one we're looking at, but there's some interesting lessons for us. So yes, we have used a lot of experience from London and elsewhere.
Okay, to come up with that. And at the moment, you haven't got a preferred option. You're working through all these different complexities. And presumably some of it's about I guess, for those who own the land, at how they capture value. You know, which actually, if you look at the Elizabeth line, actually they didn't get full benefit because all the buildings now going up above the stations and the public gets none of that.
I think that's exactly right. And I mean, you know, I've said before, it's quite unusual when you've got a project of this scale, particularly in London, to not have a major headache for how you fund the transport that you need. We've got the opposite problem here, which is a very nice problem. But the problem here is how do you capture the value and exploit the value in the best possible sense of that colossal taxpayer investment in infrastructure. So we've turned that on its head. We haven't got the sort of problems that Battersea and Nine Elms have had or Barking Riverside have had. The transport will be there. How do we make the best use of that? And how do we assemble the public sector in a way that will convince the market that it's simple enough to understand, although the public sector still has its accountability for the investment that it's made and the returns that it will be seeking.
So this year is critical in getting this all together, by the sound of it. I mean, it sounds... We should, in a year's time, when you come back before us, actually have seen some real progress on this and actually have this is how it's going to work. Is that right?
I would be disappointed if we couldn't be in that position in a year's time. I should add, actually, because I think it's relevant at this point, that although at this point, you know, there is obviously still some risk around this. Things are going well, but we haven't actually got the case agreed. But I think one of the things that the government colleagues are certainly looking to the Mayor to provide here is a real demonstration that the capacity and capability at OPDC is such that if the deal is struck, or when the deal is struck, we are in a position to deliver it. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why the Mayor was happy to, you know, provide some early capital funding, and why he's been happy to endorse the draft budget submission.
Okay, and just going through the strategic outline business case, and you put in, you use the 5-case model, which Treasury supports, but in there, in the financial case, you really stress the greatest possible contribution by the private sector. What do you mean by that?
So part of the sort of the as you said, the 5 sort of step business case is looking at the financial case. And we're working very closely with Homes England and DFT, and particularly Homes England, who are providing some expertise on financial modelling. So what that looks at is exactly as you said, you know, what is the value that the different landholders want to get out of their land, how can that be developed out, and therefore how much is the public sector willing to put in and how much is the private sector willing to put in terms of their investment. So how much debt are they willing to put into the scheme at an early stage, and then obviously there will be, you know, a share of risk and profits at the end of it. So there's very complex viability and modelling going on, looked at lots of different options. So we've got a great team from Homes England who are actually doing that jointly with us.
Right, so it's not clear yet what that will be.
It's not clear yet what that will be, but there's a lot of options, so it's very complicated in terms of the optioneerings to find the best value model, which means that we get the biggest benefits, and this links into the economic case as well, for the public person, the public benefits as a whole. So it's not just cash, it's those wider public benefits as well that we're looking for the development and regeneration of Old Oak West.
So let's just think, so then over the next year you've got your budget, which is to develop this outline business case, get that sealed with government and all those agencies. So you know we've got the land, you've got your plan now, and then you would be ready, in theory, to roll. So do you have a master developer? Are there potential partners? Where are you with that? Because you get everything lined up, and then if you've still got that process to go through, it could take considerable time.
Yeah, and that's why we've been very clear that we don't simply want to kind of sequence this with one step taking place after the other. We're compressing this, and we've worked quite hard with government colleagues to really streamline the process. So yes, the OBC is absolutely crucial, and that runs at one level. The other thing that's crucial now that we've got the local plan adopted is to establish a supplementary planning document, which will provide a lot more detail about the kind of scheme that will sit underneath that overarching planning policy framework in the local plan. And in the early new year, we're going to be spending a lot of time working with local community groups and residents, really kind of, if you like, fleshing that out, because that supplementary planning document, as well as a successful outcome from the OBC, is what will then underpin our ability to go to the market with credibility to procure an investor and development partner. And incidentally, just for completeness, that will also enable us to take a more assertive position in terms of land assembly, because we may quite possibly need to think about utilising compulsory purchase powers. And without the OBC and without the supplementary planning document, that will be very difficult.
And so in your budget for the year, presumably you have you're stepping up your planning team to help with that supplementary planning document and the engagement with the communities. Is that right?
Yes, although I mean we've got a fairly well drilled planning team already. I'm happy to say our director of planning is sitting behind you. So it's so well drilled that she's able to take the morning off and sit here and listen to us. So I think we've got the resources in terms of staff to deal with the SPDs. We are asking for some additional programme budget to support that process for next year. But the main additional capability that we're asking for in terms of staffing is very much around the development team. So it's project managers and colleagues with the technical ability and experience to really help to drive our planning and delivery of infrastructure, of design work, of procurement, and those areas where we feel at the moment we haven't quite got the resource that we need.
And just finally, when do you think you'll be going out to look for this investment and development partner?
Well, we're going to start that process next year. I mean, in terms of initial structured, we have already had some, if you like, semi-structured market engagement. And we've been doing that in a fairly consistent way. But we're going to do that in a more meaningful sense in the later part of next year. And then we will going into, on the programme that we've got, we'll be going into, if you like, hard procurement, EOIs and all the rest of it in, remind me, Lucy, when are we?
Put to early...
early 24.
Yeah.
Early 24.
Okay.
That's the current programme.
Lovely, thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay, let's turn to, if members are content, let's turn to the local plan, and that's Kripa Shirani, leading on behalf of the Assembly.
Thank you, Chair. Just to touch on the point made previously about community engagement as well, because obviously the OPDC has been formed and has been in place for many years now. And as years go by, obviously new residents groups and new businesses will come into the area as well. How are you ensuring that you're keeping up to date with what's happening in the local area and keeping any new groups informed and engaged in the process as well?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very active and well-engaged community support team at OPDC. And, you know, I would say that we have, certainly in my career experience, something that I would say is very best practice in terms of community engagement. You know, it operates at a whole number of levels. We have digital communications, we have print communications, we have an awful lot of physical meetings. We are always available. I think we've got a pretty good intelligence about, you know, who are the different community organisations, who are the movers and players, who is new on the scene, who may be leaving the scene. We've got a very, very successful community review group, which is drawn from local residents and workers who have a very structured and a really important role in advising our planning committee before decisions are made. That's something we're very proud of. We had a huge engagement process in the drafting of the local plan. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, just after Christmas, we're going to be launching a really extensive and intense programme of engagement with local residents and businesses to work up what will become the supplementary planning document for Old Oak West that I just spoke about. So I think I wouldn't deny that there are sometimes some who claim that we are not as engaged with community groups as we might be. I would be very happy to suggest otherwise.
I'm glad you mentioned that at the end as well, because members of the committee have received correspondence about engagement and local plans from the Old Oak Neighbourhood Forum regarding the OPDC, raising some concerns. But one of the concerns that they raised was the MDC model versus borough model. And given there have been so many changes since the original plans, I know there's reference given earlier to Cargiant, which was supposed to be part of the original plans, and there's been some major changes as a result of the land complications, which we completely understand. What is the value of the Mayoral Development Corporation model versus the borough model now, given the changes from the original plans? And are you still confident that it's the correct model for this development?
I think it's a really important question, because it does feel to me that, you know, there always needs to be a compelling and robust answer to that question. Otherwise, things should sit with the established local democratic organisations, which are local councils. That's why MDCs don't exist all over the place, I suppose. You have to make the case as to why there should be a special arrangement put in place. I think in terms of Old Oak and Park Royal, that case obviously was made and was approved back in 2015. It was subject to quite extensive consultation. I think the reasons for it were, firstly, this was always going to be a very challenging regeneration programme that requires dedicated resource and focus on one area. That's one argument. I think the other is that our area spans bits of 3 boroughs, which makes it very difficult to coordinate activity and really provide that integrated leadership across 3 separate autonomous boroughs. And I think, thirdly, you know, if you are going to create an MDC and effectively take those planning powers away from the local boroughs, then you need to do that with sensitivity and understanding, and also ensure that your relationship with those 3 boroughs is as close and as meaningful as it can possibly be, which is one of the reasons why the 3 borough leaders sit on our board. It's also the reason why we do delegate back quite a lot of planning decisions to the London Borough of Ealing and the London Borough of Brent. It's also why we spend a great deal of our time working closely with colleagues in those 3 boroughs. It's also why, you know, we've offered, particularly with the new plans being more focused on the Ealing end rather than the Hammersmith end, a dedicated secondee for Ealing Council to have a senior officer sat in our team. So I think, you know, I think those are the reasons why an MDC is relevant. And I think, I suppose the final point I would make goes back to this issue about, you know, attracting very considerable amounts of private investment. And I think if you're going to have the best possible opportunity to attract the best possible investors on the best possible terms, having a dedicated agency with statutory powers actually really helps. And certainly that's the feedback from all the organisations in the private sector that we've been speaking to.
Thank you. And so obviously you've referred to the adoption of the OPDC local plan, and you referred to it throughout. So what are you now going to do to accelerate the pace of development?
Well, that's absolutely at the heart of this budget submission. In terms of accelerating the pace of development, we want to, you know, turn the discussion that we've been having over the last year or two about the need to assemble a strategy that can then become a delivery plan, actually into that delivery plan and start to get on with it. So the resources that we're seeking to add into the OPDC's capability in this budget submission are all about delivery. You know, the vast bulk of them are in the delivery team. Those that aren't are mainly in things like programme management, so that there is actually an effective and joined up management of the delivery effort. And as we were saying a few minutes ago, you know, this is all about, if you like, getting a deal to get the big raw material on the table and under control, the land and the funding, and then really getting out to the marketplace to find investment partners and delivery partners. In the meantime, that doesn't mean that it's all jammed tomorrow. We are going to be getting on with the site acquisitions using the Mayor's Land Fund money. We are going to continue to be working very hard to get more developers on site. In the last couple of months, we've approved, I don't know, we must have approved 600-700 new homes. So there's real investor appetite at the moment, and we're doing everything we can to promote that activity. So, you know, I know it's an invitation that we've extended to this committee once or twice, but, you know, please do come down and see what's going on, because we'd love to host a visit.
Great. And final question for me. So I mean, you've already mentioned sort of private sector investment as well, but are there any other sources of funding which the OPDC are currently pursuing?
Yes. I mean, we have been quite successful, I think, attracting certainly modest amounts of specific grant income. So, you know, we've had money from the Heritage Lottery Fund, we've had money from the GLA, we've funded things like through the Great Places Scheme, the Good Growth Fund. We've secured funding from HS2, which helps to support some of our business and community activity. We're obviously very interested in planning income as well. So one of the things that we will be doing in the next year is introducing, subject to the relevant consultations, a new community infrastructure levy charge. So we think there is scope to increase the amount of income that comes through the planning system. So we're always on the lookout for new funding opportunities, and we'll continue to do so over the next year.
Okay, let's move on to our... sorry.
So quick. So, David, you sound very confident that the OPDC has got the capacity and the experience to deliver the development opportunities. Is that right?
I think what I've said is that I'm confident that with the additional capacity that we're looking to bring into the organisation, assuming that our budget is approved, then I am confident, yes.
Okay, and is the Mayor confident with this?
Well, he's expressed his confidence to me and the chairman of my board.
Oh,
yes.
That's good. When did you last see him?
About 6 weeks ago.
With regard to this?
4, 5, 6 weeks ago. I can't remember exactly.
So he's confident. You spoke to him about this, and he's confident.
Yeah.
That's
at
good.
Some length,
okay,
yeah.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Assembly Member Pidgeon.
I just wanted to go back to the point about your work with community groups and so on, because in some of the information we have received ahead of this meeting, let me quote one point that has come to us. The quality of communication and community engagement work undertaken by OPDC has never matched that of the better London boroughs. There was a commitment in 2014 for an OPDC community charter. This wasn't carried through. Promises for staff and or financial support to local groups have not been honoured. Could you respond to that and assure us that you are going to sort of refresh your community engagement work ahead of this next important phase?
Happy to. I mean, we, just over a year ago, I think, the board approved a new community engagement strategy. Very happy to share that with members after the meeting. Again, I think that's a best practice document. I think I know where those comments have been received from, and that is the organisation which, over the last 6 months, I think we've sent 27 separate responses to. We've met with that organisation 11 times over the last 6 months, 11 times. And a member of that organisation also sits on our community review group. So, you know, I think I would challenge a lot of the things that are being stated here. And I think the individual that sent those comments in, you know, we know very well. We do tend to hear from him on a weekly or twice weekly basis. That individual, I think, does have some quite different views about what should happen in our area. And I think that perhaps somewhat influences sometimes the tone and tenor of the comments that he circulates.
Okay, I just wanted to get some clarity given we'd had that information. Thank you.
Okay, we're moving on to the last section, and it's Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. So I'm picking up on the climate budget, and was very glad to see that come through at 3:15 on Monday afternoon. So you outline 3 projects that are all focused around energy. So there's the local area energy plan, which is working with 9 West London boroughs, along with the GLA, and you're planning to develop resilient, affordable energy and a pathway to net zero. And that is within the context of West London's problems with electricity infrastructure. And so you're looking to reinforce the conventional grid, manage demand, and bring both storage and renewable sources online to support growth. Is this a heat network?
There's a number of elements to this. I mean, the local area energy plan is a much more comprehensive piece than just the heat network. So that is looking, as you say, at the short, medium and long-term energy requirements, not just for our area, but for a wider area still. That is also very important in the context of what have been quite widely reported constraints in terms of electrical capacity in part of our area, not the whole of our area. So SSEN have got some real capacity constraints, and we're working very closely with the West London boroughs and the GLA to try and understand exactly what that means.
So that part of the budget proposal is like a sort of planning, a piece of work to kind of make plans.
Exactly, it's a crucial piece of the infrastructure planning that will be relevant to our area as well as beyond. The heat network, it sits within that, but it's a very specific project.
And that's the Old Oak and Park Royal Energy Network.
That's yes, it is.
Yeah.
And that is a plan to take surplus heat from the growing number of data centres in our area, and instead of seeing literally gigawatts of surplus heat disappear into the atmosphere, see if we can recycle that heat into a local energy network. Mm-hmm. Which would be, if we can make that work, that will be a terrific piece of infrastructure, because it's obviously making use of energy that is otherwise wasted. It will also, as far as we understand it, probably be a UK first.
I was going to say it sounds very pioneering. So is there? This is a first project. There's no precedent for doing it, for recovering the data centre energy.
As I understand it, I think there are maybe 1 or 2 examples elsewhere in Europe, but nothing that we're aware of in the UK. And with these concentrations of new data centres emerging, you know, if you do have the opportunity either to retrofit or, in our case particularly, to plug into new developments, then it just seems, in conceptual terms, to be a really simple and straightforward thing. It's much more complicated than that, and that's what we're trying to... I was going to say, nothing's
ever as simple as that. Have you compared, or are you going to be comparing, recovering data centre heat with the kind of investment that you might put into ground or air source heat pumps?
Yes, and we are going to have to demonstrate that, because, of course, the default position now pretty much is air source heat pumps for most of the residential development. And one of the reasons why we're so keen to crack on quickly with the heat network project is that if we can get through the next stage of the process and actually make this a deliverable project, then we can insist, I think, that new developments tap into that. If we can't do that quickly enough, then they will be spending their money on air source, ground source heat pumps, and it will be too late. So there's probably a sweet spot for us to hit, which is why, you know, we're really accelerating the process of scoping out whether we can actually make a heat network operate.
Are you also looking at the benefits of the canal for heat recovery?
Do you know, we have done that, and I can't remember what the answer was, but I know it wasn't straightforward.
The numbers may well have shifted given all the changes in the energy pricing, and the fact that, you know, that fossil fuels, you know, the gas prices have gone up so high. So it would definitely be worth checking on the canal, because that's I mean, why I'm asking these questions is I'm just worrying about the risk that if there's a recession and data centre growth doesn't keep going with the current trajectory, then you could end up having a system where you're trying to provide heat network energy, but on you could end up, a bit stuck, like we've just heard from the LLDC, that they went all in on gas, and that has actually caused them problems. And whether you should be actually trying to build in some resilience with a kind of multiplicity of different sources. You've got the canal, that's a really useful source for heat recovery. You've got the potential for air and ground source, and and the data recovery. And perhaps if you're working with them together, that might kind of hedge against risk of economic. None of us can see. None of us foresaw the mini budget. It's things, and very few people foresaw the massive rise in gas prices that we're facing at the moment. So, things. Yeah. Are you thinking about that kind of? Yeah. Resilience.
It's a really important question, I think, and thank you for reminding me to go away and find out whether we can actually tap into the canal, because that is something that we need to look at. In terms of the resilience point, again, it's a really well made point, because at the moment, I think our assessment is that the existing data centres have probably got the capacity to generate sufficient surplus heat to power up our network. So we're pretty confident that existing data centres have that. However, a question that has been asked, and we don't really have the answer to this at the moment, is, well, over the next 10 or 20 years, will these data centres become a lot more efficient and start to reduce their excess heat? So are there other potential sources that you could plug into a network? Because ultimately, a heat network is quite a simple thing. It's pipes, isn't it, really?
It is.
It's how do you get the energy into that network in a way that is resilient and can be sustained over 50, 60 years or more.
Yeah, and that doesn't leave you entirely dependent on one thing where its circumstances might change. Now, in the there's a very simple table for your budget, for the climate budget, and it says that you're going to be spending 2.3 million in the first year and then 60 million a year for the next 3 years. And it says the net financing requirement for delivery is proposed to be funded from an application to the Mayor's Green Bond, the UK Infrastructure Bank, or private sector funding totalling 140 million, with the type and profile of funding dependent on the preferred delivery vehicle option taken forward. And this is supplemented by 30 million grant funding from the Green Heat Network Fund, and 10 million from carbon offset receipts. So are there, are there any risks around those sources of funding?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there are. I mean, the Heat Network project is at the moment contingent on a successful bid to the government's Green Energy Network fund. I think I've got that right. I can never remember it. And that has that's a funding pot that we've been encouraged to bid for. So we need to get our bid in by February. So we're working hard on that. That, if it's successful, will give us, along with the carbon offset funding that we mentioned, the 10 million, that should give us enough to actually get on with what we call the commercial stage of the process. That, if you like, is the bit that gets you from something that looks like it should work to a point where you've actually got something that is potentially marketable. And that will, assuming that we're successful with the Green Heat Network Fund and the commercialisation phase, then you're into the CapEx, the capital expenditure, which is, I think, on current costs, I think estimated to be something like 180 million. Mm-hmm. And we know at this point, I think, that the most likely way that would come forward is some sort of partnership between the private sector and the public sector, which is very much why we're talking to the GLA colleagues about the Green Bond source of funding. Mm-hmm. So there are various steps on this journey, but the first crucial step is getting successful access to the government's Green Energy Network Fund.
Lucy, did you want to?
Yeah, no, what David said is absolutely right. But it's worth saying that in terms of risk, you spoke asked about risk, the Green Heat Network funding is a limited pot and it will run out, which is why we're looking to do this work to bid into it very early in the new year. Because that is one of the risks that we need to make sure that we bid into it quickly because it is a limited pot.
Thank you. Enver, did you have anything you wanted to add on the climate budget?
No, I'm just happy with the direction of travel, really, that we're having these rich conversations here, which we haven't done in previous years. So it's achieved what it needed to do to have this conversation. And, of course, they lead to further savings down the line, which we can come back to, and, of course, moves us one step nearer to net zero. But the particular projects that have been talked about here, we are actually having active conversations. We're hoping that the Green Finance Steering Group, which meets tomorrow, the 8th, should start to bring forward some options as to which are the ones we're going to want to explore, and that hopefully the Mayor can announce over the coming 4 to 6 weeks through the budget process. So we're looking at some of the front runners, and I think this is one of the ones that are being taken seriously to at least give it a bit of that pump priming money so that the business case can be made to attract the joint venture type of commercialisation.
Okay, so can I just ask, we're going to pick up now. Any further questions that haven't been asked on this particular topic or even part ones, we'll pick up and we'll do written and follow-up issues. There are a couple of outstanding, very quick issues. We've had 2 submissions. It's not for our committee to decide whether these submissions are, or even to do a response, but the members of the public have taken the trouble to write to us. What I'm suggesting is that actually we pass to you a copy of these submissions that we've had, and that you produce a response to each of those issues, which we would like to include on ours, so that the version from the community and a version from you in responding to the points they raise. The other one's more academic, but no doubt you'll see and respond to that. We just want to make sure there's something that goes on our website in terms of in respect of this meeting, because they've taken the trouble. You may wish to put it on your website, but that's a matter for you. We can't compel you to do that in the openness and transparency that we're all striving to do. Now, on that, lastly, can I just thank you, and thank you, Lucy, for stepping in terms of the last minute. Thank you for the way that you've answered our questions. We will be writing to you with some additional questions that may arise once we've thought through some of your answers and seen that, and we'll come back to you. So can the committee note the report and discussions? Thank you very much. Can we delegate the authority to the chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any outputs arising from this meeting? At this point, you can leave us. We've got a little bit more business to do, and give us, we're not showing any discourtesy, we just want to rattle through these final parts. So thank you very much. Okay, let's go to item 6 on the GLA monitoring reports. Can I ask the committee to note the quarterly monitoring report for Q2? Thank you. Can I, on item 7, payments over £250, can I ask the committee to note the payments over the £250 report? On item 8, the Budget and Performance Committee work programme, can we note the committee's work programme and schedule of meetings for 22/23? Thank you. And can I also then tell you the date of our next meeting will be held tomorrow on the 8th of December 2022 at 10 a.m. in the chamber. In the chamber, we're back in the chamber. Item 10, any other business that the chair considers urgent? There is no business. Can I conclude today's meeting? Thank you very much. Well done, everybody. You've